Hello. Mouse is not working. Can you guys hear me in the back well? Great. Okay. Right. Okay. We'll start. Okay. It's already 8:15. Excellent. Good morning, everyone. I hope most of you are awake. At least not jet lagged. So, as you might have seen just from the previous slide, there is a change in schedule. One speaker is unfortunately not able to make it. That means we will have a little bit more time for each talk, so more room for direct, short questions. So before I get to my talk, I would like you to guys to go to that link in the second bullet, gmp3.cnf.io. This is where most of the live Q&A will happen, I think, even through the main conference. So you were able to go there? Yeah. No, I want to. Adil wants to test it. So our course is, I think, listed under afternoon session. So just look for the title, taking control of neuroimaging quality data. Should be some questions there. So we'll get there. I think the system will take you to the right question based on the slide, right? So, all right. Yeah, I did, but they're at the very end. Yeah, yeah. All right, let's get going. I think it's enough time. So I'll be starting with a talk giving you a rough overview of neuroimaging quality control, followed by some details into how different use cases of different QC use cases of anatomical MRI. This is the rough schedule. After that, uh, there is going to be a break at about 9:45 a.m. And an open panel discussion at 11:30, where more open-ended and longer questions can be asked. Okay, so in this course, a half-a-day course, will mostly be focusing on these three modalities: anatomical, functional, and diffusion, with the goal to raise awareness of the issues and education in awareness of the issues, and to try improve education in neuroimaging quality control. I guess a lot more practical intuition than physics education, so to say, into the QC aspects. I'm gonna, before I begin my talk, will give you a quick terminology definition, so to say. I think these are important to keep in mind, although there may be a bit of a mix in how they are used. For example, quality control, quality assurance, what the different stages in QA, QC are. So, at a subtle point that's often missed in this discussion is the difference between quality assurance and quality control. So given a pipeline that looks like a multi-step pipeline that looks like this, starting with some neuroimaging input data that ends up with some output, QA is quite often process oriented. They're trying to focus on improving the quality of the process in the hope that the results will be improved. And QC is most often focused on the final product. That's the major difference. You want to keep that in mind. And sometimes, often, they are both interwoven in the way they are implemented. but it's still good to keep the difference in mind. So the goal, the focus on QA, like I said, is on the whole process, whereas for QC, it's on the final product. Whereas the QA tries to prevent defects, QC tries to verify quality, right? So that's the big difference. Oh, I forgot to mention, all the slides will be posted online, so you don't have to worry about scribbling all the details, taking pictures, so you can focus on this. Yeah, another important term, in my opinion, is artifact. It's used in different ways, mostly any error in the perception or representation of the information. I think that's how I think about it. Or simply a defect or distortion in the data, or anomaly, or even unwanted data, so to say, right? So in medical imaging, typically you're thinking about misrepresentation of tissue structures, right? Yeah, we will probably define a lot of artifacts in different modalities, like I mentioned, and provide intuition to them. But we may not always present a way to correct for you. Guys. And sometimes solutions exist, but other times they don't. Often you find issues, you have to discard the data. That means it's an opportunity for you to find a way to correct them, in my opinion. So, to give you a full scope of neuroimaging, for example, this is a typical setup. You have various modalities, like I mentioned. In my opinion, I think QC is not just what is in the image. It goes far beyond that. For example, it starts with maintaining the facility where the scanner is housed and the acquisition happens in terms of climate and hardware. It's followed by scanner QC, calibrating it and performing phantom corrections and maintaining other performance. Followed by the session QC at the particular day to ensure the scanner is in a known state. Followed by the actual neuroimaging data QC. Look for artifacts such as ringing, motion, and other types. And then, usually nowadays, with the emergence of big data, and there is a lot of multi-site and multi-scanner issues as you try to consolidate the data together. So one of the important things you take away from this course, I hope it is this, that QC is not just what is in the image, but there is a lot more things that go into the fuller framework. And like I mentioned, some of them are more QA and some of them are more QC. They might both be mixed up in some steps. So this gets me to the actual first talk on T1 weighted anatomical MRI. This would be focused on mostly describing the common artifacts you see in them, just giving you some ways to, some intuition into which processes cause them and how severe they are, what are the different levels. So the common sources of artifacts in this modality can be roughly categorized into these 4 categories: experimental error, subject motion, some hardware issues, followed by some reconstructions error. And I'll probably describe them in isolation, but they can happen together also. So this is to give you some screenshots of different artifacts, and I've copied many examples from this wonderful manual from NGH. You can also download that online. So the first of the artifacts in this modality is something called wrapping. For example, something that looks like this. I think screen is pretty good to see all the colors, right? Even from the back. So there is a little red circle. Even, in fact, it's funny that even the circle is wrapped. So you can see the nose that's wrapped around the edge. So the primary cause for these artifact is picking up signal from outside the field of view. And you can easily detect it by visual review of the image. And Typically, it's either usable or not usable depending on how much and where it's getting wrapped. For example, this I think is not usable for analyses. The other one is. So the second artifact is something called clipping, where, for example, this is a good T1 image, and a clipping artifact would look something like this, fairly easy. And typical causes are operator mistake, bad field of view, or subject motion once the setup is once the session is set up. And again, you can easily detect it by visual review of the data. And what you want to look for is brain appearing unnaturally flat. So if like this is clear, right? Um, and usable are usable depending on how much and where the clipping is, right? So in this case, I think we might be able to use it for some subcortical analyses. Like I said, all these issues will be described individually in isolation, but they can occur together, right? So another common artifact in this modality is something called ringing, striping, blurring. It's called many names, and the reason for these types of artifacts are diverse, including subject motion, hardware, and some software issues too. So the way they appear, you can't really distinguish them, even though the source is slightly different. So people tend to put them in the same category. And the easiest way to detect them is to perform visual review. For example, in this cross section, I hope you can see that. You can see the ringings. For example, I highlighted there. So as I flip between it, you can probably see it, right? Again, so you want to look for unnatural anatomy in the brain that is not naturally occurring, and ripples are bands that mirror the curve of the brain, right? So, sorry. That's the curve of the brain that typically typically follow, and different levels of severity. So the next artifact is something called shadowed arc, and its primary cause for it being undersampled data, typically in parallel imaging acquisition scenarios. And very similar to ringing, you see curved stripes. For this artifact, they're mostly through white matter. For example, in this case, you can see that here, right? So I flip between them for a bit. These are easily detected in the axial view, and for example, give you more severe form of it. That's the kind of curved stripes to the white matter you're looking for this artifact, and this can be in different levels of severity. This is another extreme form of shadowed arc artifact. I think this is also referred to by residual motion. There's a few different names. Yeah. Next artifact is something called ghosting. You can see why it's called ghosting. Variety of causes, and the most common being subject motion in this for this artifact. And what you want to look for is a displaced copy of the brain, like a fainter one that's stamped again into the image. So for example, this is a good slice, something that looks like this, as if another. So, and sometimes even upside down. This can easily be detected in the viewer by reducing the maximum intensity. So the next type of artifact is something called RF noise. Primary cause for this is signal interference that is typically additive. So a loose connection or conductive debris is another cause, which does have a clear effect on the signal. It's not just noise. And even simple clothing, such as a belt, can cause this RF noise. And you want to look for uniform light. For example, this is mild level of this artifact, regular viewing, as in normal maximum brightness, and if you reduce the maximum brightness, it becomes really apparent in this case. So it's usually straight, rigid, and organic. Does not follow the curve of the brain, unlike the other ones I've described just a few minutes ago. Different levels of severity for this too. I'll give you more examples now. For example, this is pretty bad. Is another really bad artifact. This is the streaks that you might see, right? So usually, like when you see something like this, it might look it's localized, but I would think it's just the tip of the iceberg. So you want to look for other signs of issues in the data too. So this is another example of lots of noise. So the next example is, next artifact is called the susceptibility artifact. The primary cause for this artifact is metal, presence of metal in or near the scanner. For example, dental work, or a metal hair clip, and even colored hair dyes cause this artifact. And like if something as mild and subtle as colored hair dyes happen, it can be really hard to detect unless you pay a lot of attention and specifically look for it. So for example, that's the susceptibility artifact in this particular cross section, most likely due to clips, dental clips. And you want to look for a natural black area or a type of a hole in that location. So for example, this is another susceptibility artifact. This is the black hole I was referring to, and it's usually bordered by a bright band such as this, due to the sudden changes in magnetic fields in the presence of the metal. If it is fully outside the ROI, I think data might be sometimes usable, but it really depends on how it's acquired, but you want to keep that in mind. So, like in this case, so this is bad, very bad. I don't think it's very usable. This might be, depending on how the full volume is. So the next artifact is something called abnormal inhomogeneity. The cause for this artifact is common cause is one of the coils malfunctioning in the setup. Just it's important to note, I think most systems, most multi-channel RF coils do have some inhomogeneity in them. Maybe sometimes they're designed for it, but what we're looking for is something that's abnormal that for that particular coil, right? So give you more intuition. For example, if you increase the minimum brightness, it becomes even more apparent, the abnormality in the inhomogeneity. So it can be easily detected by checking for symmetry in contrast, right? So left versus right, as well as front versus back. That's the easy way to detect it. And if the contrast is not symmetric between front and back and left and right, then that's an artifact. So to give you more intuition into this in these two slices, to the left you have what appears to be normal contrast, and the right is what is high contrast, and I don't see much inhomogeneity in contrast, either front and back or left and right. So for example, if you look at this particular two slices for different levels of contrast, it's inhomogeneous and actually abnormal for this particular coil. That's pretty obvious on the right? So like I mentioned before, this is about learning to detect them, giving you more practical intuition into it, not less physics behind it, right? So there is a collection of paper we maintain in the Jotero collection by Neuroimaging Quality Control Special Interest Group. You can always go into those papers to get more physical understanding of these issues. So those are the common artifacts. Now I'm going to give you a few practical use cases for people who are interested in actually analyzing T1 weighted MRI data. That includes something whole brain reconstruction from FreeSurfer, which is quite popular, cortical parcellations and subcortical structures, and volumetric segmentation, followed by how we can perform alignment checks, both in the case of unimodal, T1 to T1, or even cross-modal, PET, EPI to T1 or PET to T1, for example, right? So FreeSurfer is a complicated processing pipeline involving a large series of complicated steps, which means that a lot of room for errors, and they're typically categorized into these. So errors in skull stripping, segmentation, intensity normalization, misplacement of the PL surface, topological defects, and this is even for a successful run on an MRI scan without any like major issues like disease or other things. So because it's a difficult task, these errors tend to happen. So easiest way to assure its quality is to perform visual review on QC. So to give you more intuition, these are the typical outputs from FreeSurfer. This is the white matter surface, the gray matter surface. This is how they appear in a particular cross-section overlaid on the T1 weighted MRI. And most often our people are interested in the accuracy of the cortical thickness estimates that are provided from this parcellation, because this is a great biomarker candidate for a lot of different diseases. Ensuring the accuracy of these two surfaces is critical. And if you parcellation visualized on the surface would typically look something like this. This is the volumetric segmentations as you have seen before, right? So a few examples of skull stripping errors. On the left, you see that too much brain is removed, cerebellum. On the right, too little is removed. So this is just to give you some intuition into this. And segmentation error often look like this. For example, in this sagittal view for hippocampus overlaid in cyan. It's not. Don't you think you can see it? It's overestimated. It's actually very, very badly wrong. Even on the right too. And this is more examples for subcortical volumes. In this case, for example, I think these two areas are erroneous, right? And even for lateral ventricles, which are actually often quite easy to segment, there are issues with FreeSurfer due to many reasons. So you need to visually review them for accuracy before any important analyses. And more importantly, this visual review needs to happen in this multiple view if you want to care about voxel level accuracy. So I would say triple check is necessary sometimes, because what can appear as error in one view might not be in this case, as you can see. This is an example of good parcellation. This is an example of very bad parcellation, right? Just to give you two extremes. And they can appear as something like this. For example, you can see that green overlay is too jaggedy, noisy, so that's very bad. And another bad example is a big hole from central sulcus all the way to the frontal area, red lines. And often this used to be performed in a traditional sense using a typical viewer, which can be quite time consuming and erroneous. And nowadays more integrated approaches exist that make the whole process easy and accurate. And one more important use case for QC in T1 weighted MRI is to knowing how to do alignment checks quickly. So common requirement, especially if you have, if you need to ensure alignment to an atlas, for example. There are many ways to do this. One of them being just flipping back and forth between what you need to check alignment between, followed by you can actually mix the two images as two color channels in the RGB spectrum, which makes it really easy to detect them. For in this case, the red is one image and green is the other one, and you can see that they're clearly out of alignment. And another way to do it is something called checkerboard pattern, you display different images in the neighboring cells, left and right or top and bottom. And when they are similar or more or less aligned, you don't see much uh, uh, jaggedy edges. For example, when they're dissimilar, it'll become really, really obvious. And another way to do it is to extract edges and overlay them on the image, which makes it quite easy. So it's important that you check it in many slices, because what seems aligned in one view or one slice might not be. So for example, you want to look at the three views, multiple cross sections, even with edges, for example. Or if you take a simple difference image, actually, it can inform you a lot about a lack of alignment in particular two particular images. So when you have to do it for cross-modal alignment check, it gets a little tricky. This simple color mix or checkerboard, it's not often very useful because of the differences in contrast as well as resolutions. And edge computation is also pretty tricky. So animation-based checks, in my experience, have proven extremely valuable. Just simply flipping between the two modalities, or any number of modalities, so to say. In the case of quantitative MRI, can really help check alignment quickly. So that concludes the first talk. Are you guys ready for some questions? So remember that web address that I showed you, gmp3, I believe, .cnf.io. Is this working on the, yeah, okay. We'll give you 15 more seconds to answer this. gmp3.cnf.io, I believe. Oh yeah? Excellent. No. Oh, okay. So, uh-oh. Let me see.
This 100% of the audience got the correct answer of motion that voted.
Perfect. See, I did a very good job. Okay, the next question is this. What's the common cause of susceptibility artifact? Another 10 seconds, maybe 5 seconds. Yeah.
Everybody got this one too.
Perfect. Excellent. The next one. Which one of these is not necessary to judge the accuracy of cortical parcellation? Tricky question, I guess. All right, is that 100% too? Uh-oh. I guess I didn't cover this as well as I should have. But the correct answer is cerebellar segmentation. It's actually a little tricky. Usually this is not necessary. Maybe I should say that. So that leads me to the end of the first talk. Any questions?
Susceptibility artifacts are a problem even with retainers. We usually do not exclude people with retainers from fMRI experiments.
Mm-hmm.
That would actually meet a lot of young students, helping young test subjects that need that retainers. What's the matter with retainers, and why would you recommend excluding them? Have I got you correctly?
No, I think I mentioned that sometimes it could be a problem, but depending on the location and the severity of the artifact, it may not be. Right? Like the one example I showed you, I would believe that that would be useful for free surf analyses, or some manual morphometric analyses. So I didn't mean to say if you have an image with susceptibility artifact, you should exclude it. Sometimes you need to, depending on the location. Yeah. Any other questions? All right, thank you. Let me welcome the second speaker, Dr. Martina Callaghan. She's going to she's going to describe a lot of QC use cases in functional MRI.
Hi, everybody. So I'm going to talk to you today about doing some quality control and quality assurance for fMRI. And actually, a lot of what I'm going to show you is more about the quality assurance perspective. So like what Pradeep said about trying to have confidence in the data that you're getting to know that it's going to be useful. And I'm going to talk you through some of the procedures that we use at our centre, which maybe are also in use at your centre too, or something similar perhaps. So the overview of the presentation today would be, first of all, to look at QA procedures. So here what we're talking about is mechanisms that we can put in place. As Pradeep said, it's process-oriented. So mechanisms that we can put in place to assess the temporal stability of the scanner platform and the environment. And this is via routine, standardized measurements, so things that you're going to do in exactly the same way on a regular basis. I'm also going to show you what we do on a more routine basis. So when we have people going into the scanner, we want to make sure that in that case, in the in vivo scenario, that the data quality is good. And so we use an online monitoring tool for that. And through both of those aspects, I'm going to cover various different artifacts that tend to cause problems for imaging, and in particular in the context of functional imaging. So this is some hardware effects, and also some things that are specific to actually imaging an individual. If you have questions at any time, please feel free to ask them. So what's the motivation for this? Well, basically the point is that everything can be a potential source of artifact. So we need to really take care as we do an experiment to make sure that we minimize the impact of everything that's in that chain. So that's the scanner itself, the participant you're going to put into the scanner, and then of course the type of imaging that you're doing and how that might interact. And so we're calling artifacts here anything that's present in the image that should not be, that doesn't actually represent that tissue underneath. And it can come from any different source related to how we're making our measurement. So there's often an interaction with exactly what we're doing for the experiment. So you need to keep that in mind. So I'm going to primarily focus on the hardware today and how we can assure the quality of the data that's coming off the system. And from a functional MRI perspective, the key thing is that really we're looking at very small and subtle changes related to the bold response during a particular task that an individual might be carrying out, or indeed in resting state fMRI. And so we need to make sure that the system fluctuations are really as small as possible so that we can identify these very small effects over and above those inherent fluctuations in the system. So our best case scenario is really to be down at the thermal noise limit, where it's really just random fluctuations that are occurring and everything else is well under control. The other question that we can ask ourselves is whether or not the artifact levels that sometimes are inevitable, whether or not they're at a normal level. So for example, for fMRI, we're going to be using echoplanar imaging, EPI. This is a really rapid technique which allows us to have the temporal resolution we need to be able to look at the brain while individuals are carrying out a task, but it has its limitations. And the key thing about MRI is that nothing comes for free. So the speed that we get from EPI brings with it some artifacts. So are those artifacts at a normal level for your system, or is there anything that's going wrong that might be accentuating them? So the way that we approach this at our centre is to use the FBurn analysis procedure. It's described in this paper developed now 13 years ago, or at least before that. This was the report on it, where they'd already deployed it at many sites and gotten quite a bit of data to show the utility of the different measurements that they were incorporating into the procedure. So what I'm going to do is first of all give you a walk through some of the key measurements that are part of that protocol. So of course the first thing you want to do is, like I always say to people at our centre, is look at your data. So you want to make sure that those images actually just look good and look as you would expect. I mean, to be fair, EPI doesn't always look good, but it needs to look at the same level as it should. So you're looking for, are there artifacts visible there? Is there any structured noise? Is there any coil-dependent modulation that is abnormal? And that would be maybe, for example, if a coil element had broken down. So here we have an image on the bottom here. This is an image of the F-burn phantom, so called because the procedure for making it was described in that original paper. It's basically a gel phantom that is designed to be uniform because, at the end of the day, you're not interested in what you're imaging from that perspective. You're really interested in it being a stable quantity or a stable object that you can image over time. And then we've got a noise slice beside it, so you're looking now to see if there's anything structured there. And then you can look at it on a broader view by looking at a montage of the whole volume. And of course, you're acquiring data over time, so you should be looking at each of these, for example, as a movie. Okay, so the next is to look at the temporal behavior, because of course it's an experiment we're carrying out over time when we're doing a functional imaging experiment. So you want to see what is the signal level relative to the system fluctuations. And that's typically characterized by temporal signal to noise ratio, or signal to fluctuation noise ratio, SFNR, you'll sometimes see as well. And what we need this to be is as large as possible so that we have high sensitivity from a functional perspective. What you also want to do then is look for structure in the fluctuations over time. So as I said, our target is really to be in the thermal noise regime where there's equal power across all frequencies. But instead, if you have something that's giving you amplified artifact or amplified fluctuations, let's say, over time, what is the frequency? Because if you know what it is, it's a little bit easier to figure out where it might be coming from. So these are the type of data that we look at to address that. When you see volume along the x-axis, that's effectively time. So we've got the signal intensity, and you can see a fit to it. So we would expect some variability in the signal over time, so we can detrend that out and be left with just the remaining fluctuations that are occurring over time, which we can quantify, by their standard deviation, for example. Normalize those, express them as a percentage. We can also do a Fourier transform of the data, and that's what you see here. And what we want to see is that that is flat. So if there were a problem, as I said, some kind of fluctuation over time occurring with a particular periodicity, you'd now see some peaks there. So you want that to be flat, no peaks. And then you can do this on a spatial level by taking the FFT over the volumes as well, just again to help visualize what might be the source of the issue if there is one. We can also quantify drifts. It's quite natural for the frequency to drift over the course of the experiment, and this manifests as shifts in the phase-encoded direction, and depending on how the sequence is implemented, there may or may not be corrections for that. In itself, it's not really such a problem because it can be corrected with most packages via realignment. But you want to make sure that it's not abnormal and that it is something that's at the level that can be corrected. So here's an example of what you might see over the course of an experiment, and I'm showing you two different systems here. And the difference between them is a redesign of the cooling that's being used for the gradient system. And you can see that the drift is really very different across the two systems. You can also have situations where you might have different sources of drift present in the system. And here I show an example where we've got some that have different time constants. So you see this region here, there's a shift in one direction that's very short time scale, so it plateaus early, and so we don't see it after about maybe 50 volumes. Whereas then we go back to seeing the typical rising shift in the opposite direction. So to combat sensitivity to this type of behavior, because it's really dependent on the state of the system, whether or not it's been used before, it would be typical to run a warm-up set of acquisitions so that you're always doing your QA assessment in a very stable state. Another interesting measure is the radius of decorrelation. This is a very sensitive measure. It can have a number of different sources that would make it change. Basically what we're doing there is we're looking at how large an area of the phantom can we be randomly sampling data from and still satisfy the IID assumption. So really what you're doing there is you're quantifying the intervoxel correlation. So this is what it would look like. If you look at the blue line, that's what you would get ideally if you were meeting the IID assumption. But in reality, we get deviations from this, and there can be many different reasons for that. For example, smoothness imparted by the reconstruction. And so that would be perfectly normal. But what you want to know is what is the point at which that's occurring. So what is the extent over which the IID assumption is valid. And so you can project down and identify it. And again, you want that to be a stable number for your system that is sensible. So we can put all of these different measures together in one report. So this is the type of output that we look at routinely. And when I say routinely, this is every week on every system that we have on every coil. So we really want to just stay on top of it and make sure that everything is exactly as it ought to be. And you get these key quantitative values, which I show you at the bottom here, which sort of summarize what's going on. But of course, you need to look at everything and interpret it all together as one. So what happens when it goes wrong? Well, here's a pretty drastic example. And so I'm showing you this just so that you can really visualize really what can go wrong, you know, how large the differences can be when something is wrong. So you can see, for example, I pick out a few different features. One would be the structured nature of the fluctuations over time, right? That should not be the case. This should be just rather flat. Because of this, you're seeing these peaks in the spectrum. And it's also then leading to a drop in the RDC. So that means that this green curve is falling away from the idealized case much more quickly. Okay? So in this case, it was because we had a temporal instability in our RF power amplifier, so what's being used to do the transmission or excitation process. And because of that, we got all of these erroneous results. But what's interesting is oftentimes people would maybe look at SNR and TSNR, and really in terms of the numbers that we have here, we're talking about very small signal changes. If you look at the axis here, it's really small. So materially, you don't see a huge difference in the SNR and TSNR. So you have to be careful and look beyond just simple measures like that. So once we replaced the RFPA, everything was back to normal and we were in a good state again. So as I said, that's quite a dramatic case, and failures are typically much more subtle, so you really have to look carefully at all of the different values. And so now the other end of the spectrum is really these two different QA results here, which are pretty much the same. There's a small difference in the RDC, but there's nothing really to say that there's anything particularly bad happening in the system. So what can be useful is to augment your measures with additional peripheral data that you know about. So for example, here I'm showing you the voltage, and that is the voltage of the transmitter, the body coil that we're using, and it calibrates every time you put somebody into the scanner to know what voltage do I need to be at, which is basically what B1 field amplitude, in order to achieve the excitation I want, okay? And actually those two QA results are giving us really different values. And one, this one up here in red, that's a fault condition. And so what was actually happening in this case is that I mean, for me this is interesting, I don't know if this is interesting for you, but for me I found it interesting. So first of all, we thought that the body coil must be broken, you know, that some part must have developed a fault. We took it out, and actually what we could see is that the gradient coil was bulging because the cooling had actually broken and ruptured, so water was pooling and throwing off the tuning of the body coil. So in fact what we had to do was replace the gradient coil to get back to the green case there at the bottom. So that's a useful thing to measure all the time. So when you're doing your QA, you just record the values. Is the transmitter tuning properly? What else might we get? Well, center frequency. So is anything disturbing the magnet's normal operating frequency? Again, the system itself will calibrate this, so in a lot of instances it's not really an issue, but you want to know that any changes are completely understood. So for example, here's some data from one of our systems over the past year, and you see there's a big jump in the data. And this was actually when we repositioned a cabinet holding our projector within the scan room. And because the projector had to have some passive shielding on it, there was really a lump of metal near the magnet, basically. So when we moved its position, it changed the center frequency of the magnet. You also see another little point that was a little bit anomalous, and this is when we were decommissioning a 3T system to make way for 7T. Yay. So the other thing that we can do is look at the environment, because of course you want this to be nice and stable and within specification for the system. So it's quite easy then to just record the temperature and humidity of the scanner and just make sure that everything's working as it ought to. And this is something that we find actually causes one of the biggest problems. So of course then you need to make sure that the imaged object is stable in itself, and for that we use a parrot incubator. We keep our phantoms in here so that they're always at a stable temperature, because the last thing you want to do is track the temperature of the phantom, right? You want to track the temperature of the system. So here are some results then. So we see that the temperature is nicely controlled within the specs of the system, which are 18 to 22 degrees. So that's all good. Now we have the humidity, and again we've got specific limits that we're meant to stay within. So if you get a result like this, that's a fault condition and you should stop scanning. So you might say, why do we have to do that? Well, If your humidity in the scan room is too high, then you're violating the assumptions that are underlying the SAR model of your system. And that would mean potentially that the rate of dissipation of heat as you image the individual would not be what it ought to be. And in that case, you would have a potential problem. So that's not an appropriate domain in which to be scanning. On the other end of the spectrum, if it starts to become very dry, your risk of spiking starts to increase. Okay, so what's spiking? Well, we saw it a little bit already. This is something that can manifest as really structured, temporally varying noise. It can be caused by anything within the system that leads to discharges. So, for example, a loose connection would be a very good example, or any kind of stray metal that might have gotten stuck and be rattling around. And as I said, it's more likely when the environment is dry. So here's a video from one of our systems. And again, I don't know how interesting this is to you, but I found it interesting. This actually turned out to be because the shim trays, which are these trays that go in along the periphery of the bore, and they hold little plates to make the field as homogeneous as possible. So this is done at the time that your system is commissioned. But they're held together with really cheap, basically, little plastic lids that are vulnerable. So in our case, the lid just snapped, and because it wasn't then compressing the plates, they could rattle around, and that's the kind of artifact you get. So imagine trying to pick up some kind of subtle functional-based signal when you have that happening in your system. I mean, it wouldn't be possible. And this is how it actually appears in your imaging data when you have large spikes. So what's happening is that you're getting a peak, which I highlight there in case-space data. And when you do your Fourier transform, then you're getting this modulation, okay? And so the location in which it happens in case-space is going to dictate the periodicity of the modulation. So you see two different examples there. And of course, if it were off-center, then it might be on a diagonal, or all sorts of behaviors might be seen. Somewhat similarly is other forms of RF interference, but now these might come from outside the room. If for example, the RF cage is what we would term leaky, it's allowing some RF from the outside world to get into the scan room. And this can be a particular problem when you have peripheral equipment involved in your experiment. So here's an example from a TDCS fMRI experiment that was being run at our center, where we saw this case where, if you look at the images on the left, so here this is just a localizer, so yeah, they're not great images or anything, but you see that it's much higher in this case. And this is because, if you look in case space, you see this pattern of very high noise, and then this abrupt change. It's a very strange behavior. It took us a long time to figure out what was actually causing this. We knew it was related to the TDCS setup because it wasn't present in any other cases, but in fact it turned out to be the TDCS box itself which had developed a fault, which we could find by replacing it out. You can also get then RF interference that is not broadband noise, but really more structured in terms of the frequency content, which leads to these kind of spikings, which are highlighted there and probably easier to see in the profile I have on the right. So that's that kind of QA kind of approach you can take in terms of making sure that the system is behaving, everything is under control, the fluctuations are as absolutely low as possible, and that your system is in a good state. So once you have the confidence that that is the case, then you might say, well, now what can I do on a more routine basis for when I'm scanning my individuals to make sure that I'm also in a good setup there. And that's where online QA comes in. So what we do at our center is we have a setup like you see on the right. So this is basically just taking the data that are being acquired and doing some very basic analyses on these in real time. So you saw at the start there was quite a lot of fluctuation and difference. Of course, this is just because the person has been put into the scanner, and so there's a degree of stabilization where you see lots of changes. But what we have here is basically the image volume at that moment. Here it is again, but windowed down so we can look in the noise and see if there's any artifacts present, if there's anything in the background. Here you see the difference from one volume to another. And down here you see something over a larger temporal window, where we're basically downweighting volumes from the past, but it has basically like a difference over a longer time scale. And then we can look at a summary measure of the signal amplitude and a histogram. And so this isn't our typical data quality, just to be very clear. This is really putting somebody in and asking them to actually speak, to make a jerky movement, things like this, just so that we could show and demonstrate what it is that we could pick up with this type of a system. We use Gadgetron, which is an open source imagery construction framework to implement this, which is really helpful for making it work in real time, even if you have high density arrays, because you're dealing with a lot of data at that point. And so what is one of the most common sources of artifacts? Well, it's motion, and that is a big problem that needs to be addressed. So if you have a system like this in place, you can just keep a good eye on it, on the participant, and make sure that they aren't moving excessively. And if they are, you can stop your experiment right before you end up having to do the QC afterwards. Talk to them again, explain to them that they need to stay still, and see if they can actually manage to do that, or if you're going to get reasonable data for your experiment. And you need to, of course, consider then how it's going to interact with the particular acquisition approach that you're adopting. So if it's 2D EPI, which is the most common approach for acquiring data, you need to think about, how are you getting your slices? Are they interleaved, or are you doing an ascending or descending slice order? So the motion is present here. So it's just rather a brief spin history effect that is manifesting when you're doing ascending or descending. But when you do interleaved, it can be much more distributed, the effect. So we always use ascending at our center. But if you're doing something like 3D EPI, a less commonly used approach, you need to really think about how it's happening, because that motion is occurring now in k-space. And so at the top here, you see a high speed and overall motion case, but the error with respect to a reference isn't so bad. Whereas here, the speed is and overall motion is much lower, but the artifact is really very large. And this is because it depends on when, during the acquisition of that volume, the motion is actually occurring. If it happens in the center of k-space, where there's a lot of impact, it's going to really damage the data. Whereas if it happens on the periphery, it is much more subtle in terms of the impact. So as I kind of mentioned already, coaching the participants is really one of the best things that you can do. Try to restrict the motion, ensure that they can't have too much room to move around in while still being comfortable. And actually being comfortable is really important, because it makes them less likely to move. And of course, there are different approaches for correction. Prospective motion correction, for example, via tracking, which we'll hear more about later, I think. And then retrospective, for example, some form of realignment. But for accelerated techniques, you also need to consider what the impact on the reference data is going to be. So you need to use some approach to unfolding that data, and that can be extremely sensitive to motion. So if we consider intervolume motion, as I said, you can generally get good compensation via realignment. But if you're going to have an interaction with how the data are unfolded, this will be a problem. So for example, 3D EPI is an approach that can be accelerated. Multiband is exactly the same, SMS, simultaneous multi-slice. So basically you need to have some information to be able to help you to unfold the alias data. And if that is no longer applicable because the person has moved, or if they moved during the acquisition of that data, which is really problematic, then you'll have errors. And these are highlighted in red here, actually coming from the movement of the eye. So you have a lot of variability, and it's hard to estimate the sensitivities there. But if you use a more robust approach that can extrapolate and account for motion, you can do better. So another source of artifact that's already been touched on, but that's really important and is something that you can make decisions about at the time of acquisition, is susceptibility. So here we see two different slices, one quite superior, where really the magnetic field is quite homogeneous, and one more inferiorly, where you've got a lot of susceptibility differences due to air cavities and so on, bone and all the rest of it, and that leads to a much more distorted magnetic field in response to the field. So the precessional frequency depends on the magnetic field, okay? And then there's going to be a phase accumulation depending on the precessional frequency. And this phase accumulation can lead to apparent drifts, right? Because this is happening in k-space, which can lead to distortions, and it can also lead to dropout if the signal effectively cancels much more rapidly. So what could you do about that? You need to minimize the susceptibility gradient, which is the red arrow in these schematics. So on the left, we see one where the gradient, if you think about this projecting onto these orthogonal axes, so it's quite large in plane and through plane. But now we can use things like angulating the slice, so that's rotating it around a little. And we can also use something called Z-shimming, which is applying a gradient to compensate. And then you can, with the angulation, end up with a smaller gradient in the in-plane direction, in the phase-encoded direction, a larger one through plane, which can then be compensated for by Z-shimming. So of course this is something that has to be done at the time of acquisition, needs to be done consistently for your group. But you can do it in a sort of an automated sense. So previously we've had to acquire lots of empirical data to try and determine what the optimum might be. But a recent paper by Stefan Volz has shown how to basically simulate this and look at the impact by incorporating lots of field mapping data from your individuals. Just another kind of atypical source that we came across at our centre. On the left here, you see typical TSNR kind of for the acquisition that we were using, but on the right, you see a really significant loss. You see here in this frontal region, and I'm not going to try and guess what the source is, because there's lots of things that could have done this. But in this case, it was because the person didn't take off their mascara. So you should always take off your makeup before entering the scanner. But I bet you wouldn't expect that it would have such a large impact, and it really does. So. Yeah. So just as basically a take-home message, I think one of the key points is basically going back to my motivation. Everything is a potential source of artifact. So you really need to look at all of those different aspects of your imaging sequence, if you like, and make sure that you're minimizing the sources from each of those different aspects. If you don't have this type of QA procedure implemented at your center and would be interested in doing so, Evelyn Balto in Liège has put together a toolbox which basically does the type of analysis that I was showing you in the results that we have at our center, produces all of those different metrics, and she has made that publicly available, so you can download it from GitHub and use it to assess all of these different measures and see how your system is performing too. So thank you very much for your attention, and thanks to funders. Oh, actually, yes. So if you have any questions, then feel free to ask them, but otherwise I have some questions for you. I'll go to those. So this isn't to be done online, so maybe we can just have a shout out if people are brave, or a show of hands if they're moderately brave. So the question is, which instability would cause a decrease in the radius of decorrelation measure? Is it 1, an instability in the RF amplifier, 2, a broken receiver coil element, or 3, an increase in broadband noise level? Hands up for 1, 2, 3. So I say 1, and that's like the example that I was showing you there where we had that instability. So if that's happening over time, instability implying time, then you would see a reduction in the RDC. Broken receiver coil element, I think that's tricky actually. It would not if it was stably broken. Basically you'd get a hit in your SNR, right? You'd see strange images, all the rest of it, but actually it wouldn't affect the RDC per se. But if it was intermittent, it would. Right, that would give you a spiking, and that's really because your distribution is changing over time. The increase in broadband noise level, well, I mean, really it's noise that we want to have, and that would actually mask any of the correlations that were existing spatially, and so it wouldn't change the RDC, wouldn't decrease the RDC. Okay, so then which protocol settings can be changed to reduce the effect of inherent susceptibility-related gradients on EPI? Receiver coil, slice angulation, repetition time. So hands up for receiver coil. For slice angulation, yay. Repetition time, no one's going to say it now, of course, right? Yes, slice angulation. Okay, so then last question is, when is spiking more likely to occur? When humidity is high, low, or always equally the same? So hands up for high, hands up for low. Hey. Always equally likely? Okay, great. Yep.
I have 3 questions you can choose to answer.
Okay, I'll answer the easy one, yeah.
How do you measure your environmental? Do you do it with these scanner monitors, or do you have a telltale that's either inside the room or in your HVAC system from your air output? My first one.
I'll answer that. I'm not very good at remembering things, sorry. Yeah, so we do it independently of the scanner so that it's a really independent measure. It's coming from sensors inside the room that are either relayed onto the BMS display in the room, or we would have one just inside the window where we don't. If we don't have the display on one of our systems, we didn't have a display there, so we just used one inside that we could see through the window.
Okay. 2 is, can you please speak a little bit about the procedure of doing center frequency measurements? Like, do you temperature control your fans, or do you talk about how to do that?
Yeah, so it's really basic. It's just the standard calibration that's done on the scanner. So there's nothing else to it. No, yeah, but we do try and maintain the temperature of the phantom in those parrot incubators, if you saw that. So just to keep the phantom as steady as possible, so that it's really reflecting the scanner.
And third is, this is fantastic from your DQ, it's really great. For a daily QA, is there anything you do? Do you do like the standard scanner coil check when your technologists or your users warm up? Or do you do something that's like a 5 to 10 minute QA every day?
No, we don't do it on a daily basis. So once a week on all systems and all coils to make sure that everything is okay. We do warm up every day to make sure that the scanner is in a stable state before anybody starts scanning. And then we do the online QA, which is really, I mean, it's going to be variable, right? Because it's not quantitative in that sense. But the online QA with the individual in the magnet.
And is your warm up just like a couple runs EPI?
Yes, exactly. Yep. Is there, yeah. Sorry, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned that you can see it in real time. There's
Yep.
motion. Is that something installed in the scanner software?
No, it's completely separate to that. Well, you need a little bit. So Gadgetron is an open source framework, and then for each vendor, there is basically an interface that you can install. So that has to be installed on the scanner to be able to use Gadgetron. But there are other approaches that one could use. But basically, we use that so that we can get the data off. Once the data are off, they're really sent to Gadgetron acts like a server, and then you can just take the data and do whatever analysis you want. Does that make sense?
Yeah, is it still real time?
Real time, yep, absolutely real time. So that was recorded. What I showed you there, that video, that was as it was recorded.
Thank you.
Does Gadgetron also work for multi-band imaging?
Yes, there are some reconstructions for multiband as well. But the beauty of Gadgetron is that you could really put anything you wanted in there. So yes, I believe there are reconstructions for multiband. I haven't used them myself. But with Gadgetron, you could also send the data out at different points. So actually, you could probably use the scanner's reconstruction and then send the data out and then do the basic kind of, because a lot of that was just image domain stuff. In fact, all of it was. Mm-hmm.
Okay, we should probably stop there and, thanks. Oh, you want to be introduced?
Oh, sorry.
Oh. No, I think no, that's, I was just going to the Esther's. Next to speak about 7 Tesla scanning in ultra-high field. Thank you.
Yeah, so welcome everybody. Today I'm actually replacing the talk of Camille Oludak, who was not able to make it today. I want to focus today on quality control of functional MRI data that are acquired at ultra-high field, mainly on 7 Tesla. So basically, the 7 Tesla fMRI is providing us with novel opportunities with respect to SNR, but also with respect to the resolution that you're able to acquire with those systems. So basically, with 7 Tesla fMRI, it's nowadays possible to indeed acquire functional images like 2-star rated images in the order of the sub-millimeter range. For example, 0.75 millimeters or 0.5 millimeters can be used for actually tracking cognitive tasks. And this is, of course, giving us a lot of more opportunities with respect to the hypothesis we can test, with respect to the scale of the analysis that we can perform. And this is just one study I want to show you today, because this is a study that has been used a lot also for validating some of the analysis technologies. So here what was done is, in this paper, there was a focus on the primary motor cortex. It was just a very small slab acquired, and basically participants were asked to either tap the hand, so to move and tap the hand, providing motor output and sensory input, to only move the hand without without touching, to get only receive passive touch, or to do ipsilateral tapping. And this is actually providing you with very nice output or combined input and output data. And this was actually then used for analyzing layer-specific analysis profiles. And what you can see is there's a very nice biphasic response here with peaks in the upper and the lower layers for the combined motor output and sensory input condition. This is a very nice paper showing that in principle you can use those sub-millimeter resolution data to really acquire a layer-specific signal change that you can then analyze with respect to, for example, distracting input from output signal flows. And this is just a very brief overview over the possibilities you have with those layer-specific data. So for example, dissociating input from output signal flows is just one possibility. Another possibility is, for example, to look at feed-forward versus feedback processes, which also often take place in different cortical depth. There's also the possibility to look more closely into processes of perceptual sharpening or processes that are associated with associative cognitive functions. So it's just a lot of possibilities that you have in order to actually really describe the cortex in a third dimension, in the dimension of the cortical depth. And this is actually opening up a really novel area of fascinating questions. And this is why today I want to actually excite you a little bit, to jump into this novel field of 7 Tesla fMRI on the one hand, but on the other hand, I also want to draw attention to a lot of artifacts that actually are caused by those kind of data, and you have to be very, very careful actually controlling those. The purpose of the talk today is therefore to provide an overview over the most critical 7 Tesla fMRI data artifacts, and I want to focus actually on those that you at the moment can to a certain extent handle using available software tools. So I'm actually trying to give you a small guideline also how to handle some of those artifacts using available software tools. An artifact, as I define it here, is, as we heard before, either something that is observed but not actually present, but actually particularly in layer-specific analysis or in looking at fMRI signals at the sub-millimeter range, you also may actually observe something that is there, but it may actually lead you to draw wrong conclusions if you don't interpret the data correctly. So it's those kind of two types of artifacts that I want to focus on today. So I want to focus on signal dropouts, geometric distortions, motion, and also changes in the B0 field, layer segmentation, and vein effects. So let's just start with the signal dropouts. Signal dropouts can be a quite serious concern, particularly when you look at subscale functional imaging data. So this study here used 2-photon microscopy in rats and mice to actually see how the bold signal is dependent on the orientation of the cortical surface to the B0 magnetic field. And here what the authors did was modeling the contribution of the cortical surface with respect to the static magnetic field. Here you see this phi z angle that is actually showing you that there's a very different orientation of the different areas of the cortex with respect to this magnetic field here just shown in this vector. And you see that there is a strong dependence of the bold signal dependent on the orientation of the cortical surface to the B0 magnetic field. It can be a variation up to 40%, which is quite dramatic, I think. And this is also has also been shown using real fMRI data in human subjects. So you do have this very strong influence of the orientation of the cortex with respect to the signal you actually measure, and this can, for example, lead to dropouts. If you see here those layer-specific effects I showed you before, they can really sometimes disappear in those very highly folded areas of the cortex, which can sometimes be corrected, as I show you at the next slide. So there's different possibilities you have to actually model the contribution of the curvature or the on your bold signal. One possibility is described in this paper here. So what you can actually do is, for example, using a cortical surface reconstruction, you can model for each vertex, you can actually model the respective angle distribution that you get, and then you use it as a regressor in your model. So for example, here it is shown that you can see that area 4 and area 2 are compared, and you see a lot more of those signal variations in motor cortex compared to the sensory cortex. So the better the delta R2 star is just showing you the difference between the 0 vector angle and the 90 degrees vector angle. And you see here, for example, in this study, using this as a regressor, that there's also a high correspondence to your FA values with respect to this parameter. Another possibility you have is a very different one, so you can also think about your sequence. So as you also saw in the previous slide, there is a particular problem in gradient echo sequences with respect to this particular artifact. And there is a lot of studies that show that there's less sensitivity towards signal dropouts for spin echo sequences, for example, because they use this second, so they actually have 2 RF pulses, and the second refocusing pulse is then to a certain extent reducing the influence of the orientation on the signal. So this is also what you see here. So spin echo sequences do have the problem of being a bit slower compared to the gradient echo, but it's still a problem, still a possibility, for example, for very robust block design experiments. The second aspect I want to talk about is geometric distortions, which actually pose a serious problem particularly for API data. So as you also heard before in the first talk, you can actually do those contour lines when you look at how an anatomical image and a functional image can be realigned to each other. So very often what you do, particularly in 7 Tesla fMRI studies, or 7 Tesla MRI studies, is that you have a very high resolution anatomical image, which is very often giving you the subtle details of the anatomical structure you're looking at, and then you're actually acquiring an additional functional image where you then want to actually relate those data to. A particular problem that you're then facing is if the functional image is not 100% correctly overlaid to the contours of the structural image, then of course you can actually not really interpret the data anymore, particularly not at the really sub-millimeter scale. So this problem is a major problem, particularly in high field analysis, because you do want to have this really sub-millimeter precision in your data, which is actually sometimes not possible when the data are distorted, even after you apply, for example, affine registration to the image. And one possibility we have, and that we also use at our site in Magdeburg, is to implement point spread function mapping into the acquisition pipeline. So what is done here is actually there is a reference scan measured directly before you measure your API sequence. And this reference scan is then used for applying a 3D Fourier transformation, and is giving you then this 3D PSF image, which is basically calculating the local shift in the distorted phase encoding dimension, creating a shift map that can then actually be used to correct your acquired API data sets. And this correction is actually done online. So you actually, at the output level, you already get those distorted and corrected data out of your processing pipeline. And when you look at one example image here, so those PSF mapping correction can actually massively reduce those geometric distortions. So here you again have the contour line of the reference image and the acquired API image with the correction applied and without the correction applied. And you see that those two images actually strongly realign again. So there's a massive improvement by this specific PSF correction. This is another example where the influence of the different phase encoding directions for API images is shown. And again, you do see actually that the corrected image is much less distorted, much less changing with respect to the phase encoding compared to the uncorrected image. And here it's also, as you heard in the first talk, we just did a subtraction image, and you actually see that there is a lot of difference in the signal for the non-corrected image, but there is a relatively stable signal for the PSF corrected image. However, this is a methodology which I should point out here, which has to be implemented into your sequence. So it's not something that you can do post-hoc with your data, but it's actually really something that the physicist team is implementing into your MRI sequence. Another possibility you have actually to correct for geometric distortions, or let's say to handle geometric distortions, is to use anatomical data with identical readout as functional data. It's actually a different approach. So rather than actually correcting the geometric distortions that you have in your image, the approach taken here is that you actually acquire an anatomical image that has the same, let's say, the same distortions as your functional image, and then those two images are then aligned and can also be interpreted in the same space. So here in that example, this is an MI API sequence that has the same readout as the functional data. And then actually this can be used, for example, for free surfer segmentation. So you can actually put this simulated MP-RAGE image into your anatomical free surfer pipeline, and can then also conduct surface mapping. And this framework that you have there is then actually presenting with the same distortions as the functional image. So when you register the data, for example, you're actually analyzing them in the same space. Another problem that we heard about before is motion. Motion is also a major problem, of course, in 3 Tesla fMRI experiments. It becomes, however, extremely critical for 7 Tesla fMRI experiments because you sometimes, as I showed at the beginning, you are looking at voxel sizes of around 0.5 or 0.75 millimeters. So even a motion of around 1 millimeter is getting you into serious trouble if you want to look at layer-specific analysis, if you want to conduct layer-specific analysis. And also another problem that you have with 7 Tesla fMRI data is that you often acquire SLAP data. So you often acquire data with a reduced field of view to actually really improve the SNR and the signal change within your small SLAP. And what can then happen is, I think it was a very interesting paper that was published at our site 2 years ago, is that particularly for those SLAP data, you do often have very erroneous retrospective motion correction. So what we saw here is that the correlation coefficient between the correct image and the retrospectively motion corrected image, for example, using SPM, was very, very weak. And this was actually because the signal fluctuation that was induced by the experimental paradigm was massively, of course, influencing the data. So you can imagine this was a SLAP acquired in the primary visual cortex. And then actually conducting a visually driven experiment is changing almost the whole signal intensity within your SLAP. And this is actually taken then by the motion correction algorithm as a change in the voxel location. So the algorithm can no longer actually detect doesn't anymore have any fixed locations to focus on. So the whole image was shifted according to the experimental manipulation. So it was actually not working with respect to the standard analysis tools. And another problem, of course, that you have is not only that with small SLAP data of high signal intensity changes that the motion itself cannot be corrected, but of course you do also have strong effects of the change of position within this motion that actually then also leads to distortions with respect to gradient field nonlinearities. And one possibility that you have to correct for those kind of motion effects, some of those motion artifacts, is to use prospective motion technologies. Again, as before, this is a technology that has to be implemented into the MR environment, so you don't apply it post hoc, but you have to really build it into the system. And this PMC correction technique is composed of an optical camera with included lighting that tracks the motion of a passive Marie phase tracker. This is a very small device, and this is actually how it looks in the system. So you actually have this camera attached to the scanner bore in around, I think, ideally 20 centimeters away from the target. And the target then is actually tracking the motion of your brain, in that case, online. And this is why you usually fix it to a mouthpiece that is then attached to the upper teeth, because they really move a lot in line of, they're moving in line with your head motion. Some sites, I think, do also attach this to the forefront, to the skin. However, you have to remember that you can also move your skin without moving your head. So I think attaching it to the mouthpiece is giving you much more reliable results. The camera can then track 6 degrees of freedom, the motion in 6 degrees of freedom. This is just an example of the tracking data, which are highly accurate. So they have an accuracy of around 0.01 millimeters. And they're as accurate that they can even detect single heartbeats that make your brain pulsate, actually. So they're highly accurate. And what then happens is that those data are tracked online, and the field of view is updated online to actually correct for those head motions. And this is one example image here where a very high resolution 0.25 image was acquired with and without such prospective motion correction technologies, and you see a massive improvement when the correction is on. The only thing that you have to have in mind or keep in mind is when you want to use those technologies is that you have to calibrate it before use. So at the beginning of the day, you calibrate the technique, and then you can use it for multiple subjects, multiple scans afterwards. Oh, sorry, and I also wanted to say that you can also combine this prospective motion correction with additional technologies that correct for the gradient nonlinearities. So there's a lot of possibilities also to extend this algorithm further to also correct for the distortions that are associated with the motion, as I indicated before. A further, I think, important aspect about the quality control of high-resolution data is to think about how you actually finally segment your tissue, because mostly when you do 7 Tesla imaging, you actually do want to have sub-millimeter and very accurate segmentation of the different tissues involved. And this is here one example of an algorithm that was developed to automatically segment biologically based cortical layers in the big brain. However, this technology is so far only available really for data where also the sub-millimeter tissue components are available. So this is at the moment not available for in vivo data, but only for ex vivo data. So for in vivo data, actually you do have still to model the layers, so you cannot directly measure them, but you just have to rely on certain modeling technologies that are available. And this paper, which I think is very nice, compared the different technologies to model cortical layers and validated that the equivolume model seems to be most correct for actually estimating the layers in different cortical depth. So just very briefly, the main assumption of the equivolume model is that the changes of the surfaces across different cortical depth and across different curvatures are actually preserving the volume, and however are then changing the cortical thickness but also the spread of the layers. And this seems to be most closely to the real biologically based data. And therefore, implementing this algorithm into your pipeline is actually giving you the possibility, rather than just dividing, the cortical depth into equidistant layers, it's giving you a more accurate estimation of how the folding influences your layer estimations. And this algorithm is implemented in the MyPath framework, for example, but it has recently also been implemented into the FreeSurfer pipeline. So you can also use this in FreeSurfer to more accurately actually model the contribution of the depth on the layer segmentation. The last aspect I want to focus on is the effect of veins on your data. So I think it's a major issue in 7 Tesla fMRI that the vasculature is strongly influencing your bold signal change, and this is particularly important if you want to look at cortical depth specific changes in your signal. So the bold API effect is mostly driven by venous veins, but also venules, and the major problem is, for one, that the ascending veins are not equally distributed across different cortical depth. So actually, even when you have an equal neuronal signal across all cortical layers, you will have actually a higher signal at the superficial layers, just because of the contribution of the distribution of the veins in those different cortical depth. So your pure signal is actually not wrong in the sense of, you remember the second definition of an artifact. So this is actually a signal that is true, it is there, but you may not be able to derive correct conclusions, because it may not actually indicate you a strong activation of your superficial layers. It just may indicate to you that the venous contribution is higher. So this is a major problem of those draining veins. A second problem is that you have those pile veins that just spread across the cortical surface, and actually they spread around your signal a lot superficially to the perpendicular to the cortical surface, and it can also make your bold signal then very, very imprecise. And there's actually a couple of technologies that are trying to correct for those kind of problems. One, perhaps the simplest approach, is you can try to remove pile veins, either by creating a filter and filtering out just the bold signal that is derived by those venous compartments, or you can also just remove the upper 20% of the cortex. So this is a very nice study here where a stimulus was used, that is a visual stimulation protocol was used that is producing like an M shape in the visual field. And you see here that it's particularly error-prone in the superficial layers, whereas the signal is much more precise in the lower and middle cortical layers. So just by removing the upper part of the cortex and focusing on the lower layers is giving you a more precise signal just for a first start. However, there are also more sophisticated technologies to correct for those kind of problems. So what you can, for example, do is you can combine your functional task with a guess challenge, where you then actually model the contribution of just the baseline signal fluctuations. So here, for example, it's a very nice example of, again, focusing on primary motor cortex and a tapping paradigm, as I introduced at the beginning. And here, when you just look at the raw signal change that is driven by the task, you may think that your activation peak is actually in the superficial cortical layers. However, what you see here, just by looking at the data that are produced by the GUST challenge, just during pure rest, is giving a very, very similar profile. And just by actually normalizing your functional data by those resting data, is actually then showing you that your true activation peak is actually at the middle of the cortical depth. This is also similar when you use a normalized cortical profile. So this is technologies that you can use for actually correcting your data for those baseline venous compartments and then trying to find out which is really the effect of your experimental manipulation on your data. Another possibility that you have when you want to focus on connectivity, layer-dependent connectivity, for example, is that you can model the influence of different compartments on your dynamic causal modeling approach. So here, what was basically done is it was a little bit of a simplified approach of modeling only 2 compartments. So it was assumed that there was just 2 different compartments in cortical depth. And there was a factor introduced that was modeling the draining time that the blood takes from lower to superficial layers with respect to the signal influence of the draining veins, and the coupling parameter was modeled that shows you the strength of this influence. And it's just this one additional parameter that was added actually to the DCM model, which can then allow you to test hypotheses, for example, on how the lower layers are influencing the upper layers. And with respect to such models, which is actually, I think, a strong developmental procedure at the moment to actually develop further those models. This is a very, very new approach that has just been uploaded in bioarchives. So here, actually, this approach is taken further, but here, in that case, the effect of ascending veins and venules, but also draining veins at the surface, is modeled individually. So here, venules are modeled according to the balloon model, which we also, for example, use in SPM, but is here expanded for multiple cortical depth. And here, in that approach, the ascending veins are modeled as the sum of blood inflows from the venules of the same depth, and the lower depth of the ascending vein minus the outflow of the upper depth. So it's a little bit complicated, it's also a lot of mathematics involved. What I just want to show you here today is that this model is actually really trying to model the contributions of each of those different blood vessels on your data, which is then, for example, allowing you also to test different assumptions, but also to validate your data. So here, for example, this model was used to reproduce the functional activity profile that I showed to you at the first slide. So here, this is again this biphasic response that is driven by touch and motor output, as I showed you at the beginning, using CBV and both signals. And this model was actually able to reproduce exactly this biphasic response for the CBV response, but the actually one peak response for the bolt response. So it's just this kind of modeling technologies that you can use also for verify your analysis, but also to derive specific hypotheses of how your experimental paradigm can perhaps drive your real measured data. And this is already, so I'm already coming to the end of my talk. So I think one very important thing that you have to keep in mind is that successful 7 Tesla fMRI studies is not possible without those kind of quality controls, because the raw data are often very highly distorted, and also the data that you get out of your pipeline are often not really interpretable in the way you want to interpret them if you don't correct for those kind of artifacts. And those tools, as you see, are constantly improved and updated. So it's a very new field. 7 Tesla fMRI is just developing, and it's actually a lot of people who are working right now on those methods. So it's really worth to getting in contact with those people and actually building up a very collaborative and multidisciplinary network to actually always trying to keep updated on the best ways to correct your artifacts. So in a way, there's not yet a kind of a standard way to correct those data. It's really something that the researchers are still developing and improving. And as I want to point out to you, in case you are planning to do some 7 Tesla experiments, and you, for example, are thinking about choosing your site for doing so, it is important that some of those methods have to be implemented into the EMR scanner environment. So it is worth actually communicating with the site you want to do your research, whether those technologies such as prospective motion correction or PSF mapping are already implemented, are in place, and can be used by you in your study. And with this, I would like to thank you very much for your attention. happy to answer any questions.
Now for something a bit different. Maybe not totally different, but here we go. So at that, some of these slides are going to have kind of funny looking URLs on them. So that site that's there, I'm going to be referring to, I'm going to be having some example code up, and some of it is not, so basically note that site. The first part is the OHBM 2019 Etzel QC. That's not for the whole session, it's specifically for some of what I'll be showing today. So, okay, so I'm going to talk about what I call dataset QC, and I had put in the abstract for the talk when I was proposing this talk that it's to verify that a dataset's contents match its description. And then then we heard Pradeep's talk this morning, and I was like, what I'm calling quality control, I think is what he would call quality assurance. I'm not really up on terminology, so I'm going to be saying quality control all the way through. I think you'll be able to follow. So at the first part, you might be saying, why do I even need to talk about data set quality control? This is a solved problem. Just run bids or the bids validator or something else like that. If you have the files, everything's good. And bids is very good. Don't get me wrong, I'm a very big fan of bids, but it's not sufficient. You can have a valid data set according to bids or a program like it where everything's in the right format that's still unfortunately unusable. It could be contaminated by some very serious artifact that you didn't find till late. You could have given the participants the wrong instructions, so you can't actually test what you had wanted to test. There's all sorts of nightmare scenarios where you can have a valid but unusable data set. So I don't see data set quality control as something that you just do at the end. Instead, I see this as a set of procedures, stuff that's woven in all the way through data collection, acquisition, processing, analysis, as I think will be made clear. So I'm going to kind of go in that order, but it's not really that discrete. So why do we need it? I kind of alluded to this already. So that your data is usable, both by you now, today, by you in the future, by other people in the future. And also to maximize the chances that your analyses are going to produce accurate results. Unfortunately, there's a lot of errors don't make blanks. They make beautiful blobs. And I'm seeing some nods by some people that have probably experienced how beautiful erroneous results can be. And then also, just as a practical matter, an awful lot of grants now are requiring submission of the data set to a repository afterwards, or you probably want to do that anyway, and you have to have some of these pieces in place to be able to do it. So I'm going to be getting in, and it's okay to ask if you have a very brief question as we go on, but hopefully there'll be time later. Okay, so what can this look like in practice? So I'm going to start with kind of a trip down memory lane to what I did with a study in 2007, though I have a feeling this is still going to sound very familiar to anybody doing task fMRI or any sort of fMRI. So there were two of us involved in data collection, and we used scripts and things to make sure that we were really giving, keep everything coordinated, make sure we were giving the screening questions right and stuff. And then as I was collecting the data, I put the files for every person into the separate directories, looking by eye to make sure all the naming was consistent, everything like that. Then I did the pre-processing in SPM, kind of a combination of clicking through the menus and then making batch jobs. I was actually pretty impressed with myself when I was looking for some of these files. I have, screenshots of, okay, here's how you set the settings for this SPM menu. So it wasn't too bad either. I could tell what I had done. And then as I ran analyses, I copy-pasted images from SPM and R into Word to kind of write up documents about it and share it with my colleagues. And is this manual, kind of manual meaning kind of a lot of clicking around, dragging files, checking things by eye? Is this whole procedure horrible? Well, not really. I was impressed with myself that I could find the the files and results and some of the descriptions 12 years later. But there were only 16 participants in the data set, and there were 2 of us running the experiment, so we were able to kind of keep everything under control. Is this procedure perfect? And no, I'm going to be pointing out some flaws and improvements and better solutions as this goes. So let's actually try one of these polls. I had the warning thing there. So this is a real online thing. So hopefully it says when playing as a slideshow, it will display live content, but it's not. So they must not have these online. So what the question was, if you can see it, let's see, I might be able to see on this thing. Yep, some people voted. So it looks like most people are saying, oh, so there are still a few of you that are working with data sets under 30 people. It looks like about half, between 11 to 30, 31 to 100 has the most. Fair number with with the 101 to 1,000. But regardless of, whoops, if I can do the mouse. Oh, magic. You guys did some magic. Okay, so yeah, there's the results. So that is, if I can click out of this now. Go, next slide. Aha. So yeah, that's probably self-evident also, by the way. I was describing my 16 subject data set. Those sorts of clicking through workflows just plain don't scale up. And come on. Okay, now we have like 4 of them. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about this data set that I've been involved with for a few years now. And we're currently at 90 subjects, but each of the subjects has multiple scanning sessions and all of that. And it's a lot of data compared to what we used to work with. And this really isn't a big data set. The UK Biobank, aiming for 500,000. I'm not going to be clicking through 100,000 files to look to see if they're named properly and have the right contents. It's just plain impossible. And even if I wanted to, I would almost certainly make mistakes. So, because we're all humans. So, for one thing we all probably know about is that humans are not very good at visual search. So here's a little quiz. I'm going to put up a little screenshot. You don't have to click on anything for this quiz. It's a virtual quiz. I'm going to put up a screenshot of a directory, and I want you to tell me find the typo. Which one of those has the wrong subject ID? And there's actually some clues, but it's that one. It has a 777 instead of a 99 in it. And even though it was like highlighted, has the V2 next to it to give a few cues, it's really hard to see this type of error. And it's probably obvious, but these small sorts of errors can cause huge problems when you're doing analyses. If we happen to have a subject ID that had the 99 and the 77 instead of the 99, I could be pulling the wrong file, which of course could be really bad. We could if I was submitting the data set to a repository, that file would show up missing because it was misnamed, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of you are probably thinking, well, duh, just run a script and check all the files. And yeah, we do that. So here's an example of, so what this is you just write a script. The bids validation thing does some of that. You can write your own to do it more consistently. That just searches the directory structure. So here we have in this first column, zeros mean missing, and there's a couple of people there that have missing files. So I start, being the project manager type person, I start investigating, and this one, the RA, they didn't, but say the RA forgot to bring the script. And that's why we don't have the status. So now we have to make decisions. Okay, are we going to have to invite this participant back in order to collect this missing data? What are we going to do about it? And then, okay, now I look in this person's directory and I see a file with an underscore. And it's like, oh man, is that a typo or is that some other file that got misnamed? So all of this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When you're finding these kind of errors afterwards, it's a lot more work than if you can find them in the first place or not have them in the first place. And the number of inconsistencies like this that you're going to get are going to scale up probably exponentially with the complexity of the project and the number of people that are involved in data collection. Everybody's going to have their own idea of the best way to organize the papers and that kind of stuff. So this is kind of what I was saying. We're all human. Mistakes, surprises are going to be happening. We have to try to minimize the likelihood of errors. We're not going to ever get to zero. So how do I suggest doing this? Checklists and SOPs. So checklists, I do literally mean to follow and physically mark a paper checklist for every single participant as you're running them and possibly also as you're going through the data acquisition. And sometimes I get a fair bit of pushback from this idea. So I like to, this is one of my patented stories, that think about parachuters. So my husband was a jump master, and he went through hundreds and hundreds, thousands of hours of training, practice jumps, how to tell if every single part of the parachute was in working order. And that's, well, smart. You don't want just anybody telling you, okay, jump out of the plane now. But even after going through all of those qualifiers, he didn't rely on his memory or invent his own system of double checking the parachutes. He had a checklist. The pilot of the plane had checklists that they went down every single time. And we might be saying, why? You know, I was just saying how much work my husband went through to get qualified. These people are smart. Can't we just trust them to do it the right way? Well, no, because expert humans, we are all still human. And strictly following well-designed checklists seems to be one of the best ways in practice to try to make sure everything's done every time. So I think that this is more acceptable for parachutes and pilots because it's really obvious what happens if there's an error. But an unusable data set is a big deal for us too. I mean, it may not be a splat, but it's still years and years and millions of dollars of wasted. So here just quickly, this is a screenshot of that I pulled from one of our checklists. We have them printed out. The RAs fill them out on paper as they go through the protocol. Then we scan them in afterwards, and they're stored with the rest of the files for that person. And so that also gives a bit of accountability in that we do all look at these. They know they're stored afterwards. And then these are kind of living documents that you're always updating if things go wrong. And yeah, that's what I was just saying too. And I'm not saying these are like perfect. It's just every experiment, every center is going to need a different set. So beyond checklists, SOPs, standard operating procedures, are explaining how to do the steps that the checklists are just to remind you of. Here's a bit of ours just to kind of give an idea. This is a massive document, but it's also a pretty big project. The detail, again, I think generally needs to get more, you know, the complexity is going to be increasing as the number of people, duration of the project, all that increases. But really, I think if an experiment is important enough to be run, to go through ethical approval, get the funding, all of that, it's important enough to have an SOP formally written out and actually released with the data set. I think it ought to be considered an essential part of the data set. So this is kind of, so that was kind of some high level, maybe like managing the people a bit, trying to minimize errors. This is a little bit of a shift, though it's still in that flavor of talking about scripting, because how you set up your procedures can make a big difference in how quickly you're catching errors. So for a concrete example, we use ePrime to show our experiment stimuli. It's like PsychoPy presentation. There's a lot of those sorts of programs. And it makes its own outputs, which we convert as quickly as possible out of the proprietary format into just a text. So one way to do this is that the student or whoever could click through box where our files are, highlight the ones for the person in the raw directory, download them all locally, open up ePrime, put the files into it, click through the menu conversion, save as with the new name, and then upload the new files to the new directory. And yeah, that works, but who the heck wants to do that? And it's really, really prone to errors, you know, if you make a typo all the way through. it's problematic. So a better way to do it is that bit of our code, and this is one of those files that's actually in that directory I was talking about. It won't work for anybody else's code, but some of the checks and how we're pulling the files from Box, everything else would work for other files. So the steps with this is just you pull a copy of the script if you don't already have one. At the top little bit of the file, the person running it enters in the subject ID and this which DMCC, which is referring to sessions and waves. And then you run it. And if there's no errors, you're like, okay, we're good. And I'm confident of success with this because I know that the script was designed to fail. If something is not exactly correct in the file naming, the location, all of that, it fails. Do we catch everything? No. These are also updated when stuff slips through. But it does seem a lot safer. So again, I consider these standard template scripts kind of part of the data set procedures. Okay, so another one is that even the best automatically generated quality control summaries aren't going to be practical if they're just too big. So this is a little bit of some of the fMRI prep output that it makes. So the fMRI prep, if you ever done pre-processing that way, makes beautiful output. But one of our participants has well over 50 pages of stuff to scroll through. And that's a lot. It's really hard to look at that quickly. And then like these XNAP burn ones, they're also pretty cool, but there's one for every single run. And when I have 100 or more runs per person, that's, again, a lot of clicking. And that kind of, yeah, that sounds whiny. And maybe I'm just lazy with my mouse, but it's also human nature. I can't kind of mentally remember across 1,000 pages of output how the movement was looking in relation to my task. I just plain can't do it. So the alternative that we found work really well is to use these dynamic reports. And I'm going to do a little bit of illustration over the next few pages, hopefully to illustrate what I mean by that, because I'm not really sure of an exact name for this strategy. And it's basically summarizing what we find for our experiments to be the most key things, and then we can always go back and look at the full reports when we have to. So again, here's the source. So this is, for our particular study, I make a lot of plots like this to summarize the movement, and the details don't matter, but there are some horizontal lines there that are actually giving our task blocks. So for this thing, I can see that, okay, this frame hit our censoring threshold, and it's in between our two task blocks during a rest period. So the person probably just looked like they moved a little bit during the rest period. I'm not going to worry about this. So this is just a way to show for us some of the stuff that's been useful. Then we also include these TSNR, standard deviation type images, totals of censored frames. And what these look like is there are these big reports that have all these elements in them all together, so I can easily scroll through for one person altogether. And just one more quick summary example is this for behavior. And this URL, this is actually the only one that I managed to get live as a full tutorial, example code, example everything beforehand. Hopefully more of these will be added. But yeah, that URL has the code and explanations in a lot more detail. But basically, I really like this kind of plot. And what this is these sorts of things. This is one of our tasks, 2 runs, and all of these little tick marks are our trial onsets. Then these pinker lines are which button they pushed and when, and the little tick marks are if the trial was correct or not. So with a little bit of practice, the RAs are actually quite good at looking at one of these and saying, Joe, I think you better look at this subject. So we've had one person about halfway through a run just stopped responding. And that's different than if, somebody can have low accuracy pretty consistently, or you can see they're hitting buttons, but they're always wrong. Those kind of behavioral things can be really hard to spot if all you're looking at is average RTs or average accuracies. So this kind of plot for our tasks has been working very well. And obviously this is our tasks, but something like this probably would work for other people's tasks. We also have code in the files to automatically count, if it said it was an NN trial, was the word that was shown as at this time actually shown at that time to actually check the experimental manipulation? Because if something goes wrong, we want to know it right away. And then stuff about performance. So what I was saying is all of those I was showing you, these are just little snippets of these dynamic reports, these that are, in our case, PDFs compiled from knitr code templates. And I really, really like R and knitr. I'm going to be talking about it at the Open Science Room in like a 5-minute thing. So ask me for lots of details, but it doesn't have to be R and knitr. So I use R, LaTeX, and then PDFs, but you can actually use Python for the code, Markdown instead of LaTeX, HTML, and there's a lot of options that will work with the same strategy. The key is that it's a little bit like Jupyter Notebooks, if you're more familiar with those, in that you're mixing the code and the text together, but then you compile it into a static document that can then be archived. So here's a little bit of one of ours. You can see the text bits were LaTeX in the template, and then all of these brain images were read in an R loop, sent to a plotting function, plotted out with the threshold. And there's some tutorials on making brains into these files on my blog, mvpa.blogspot.com. Look for the knitr tag. So there's a few big advantages of this kind of thing. So one is that in that 2007 study I was talking about, I was summarizing everything for my collaborators by copy-pasting result images into Word. I don't do that anymore. Everything now is completely in knitr, and we have most of the lab doing it. And a big advantage is that you can actually check the sources. So if you're looking at one of these, if somebody sends me a file and, this is this is the contrast I got, and I'm like, did they actually pull the contrast they think they pulled? Is that the right image? With a knitr, I look in the R and W file, the source file, I look for the path of which image they plotted and look to see if it was the one that they should have plotted. But with a Word, you've probably all done this, where you have to look, is there a note that says which contrast the file should be? Can I find the file? Can I open up AFNI, overlay it, you get the message. So, but a big caveat is that confirmation, this linking, only works if you absolutely keep the PDF and the source file together. If there was a way to actually connect them, I would. But as we do, this is some of our storage directories, we just always have pairs of these files. And if you look in that sample directory I gave the URL to, you will see pairs of compiled and source files are always kept together. So this, I said I work in knitr basically always if I'm working on a new analysis, anything like that. I don't copy paste anymore. And that's good if you're doing stuff interactively, but sometimes you just want to have, a set of standard files. You don't want to be doing everything one at a time. So for those movement files I was showing you earlier and the behavioral summary files, those are something that we want run on every single subject. I'm not going to be interactively making it up again every time. It's a standard thing. So to make those standard, I make a knitr template, except I have these key variables, subject IDs and stuff blank. And then I have a script that I wrote, start here, and there's an example of this in the directory. So the RAs, or even the undergrads, can do this with a smidge of practice. They open up the start here script. They write in the subject ID and a couple other things of which session they want to run. They run the script, and it makes this entire directory structure and puts in that subject's information into all of the source knitters. So if I open this up, there would be a couple dozen knitr files in these directories. And then I also have this knitr commands. So what they do then is just they source knitr commands. They just run it. And you can see that it's setting the working directory and then compiling every single PDF and moving it to a directory. And you can see the output of this in the directory, but then we get a full set of results for each person all at once. And that was what I was saying. We found this to work quite well. You know, somebody has to initially write and maintain the scripts and templates, but then pretty much anybody can run them and look at them and alter them. So this is this next piece, I'm almost to the end, is kind of what I consider almost the big payoff, in the sense of trying to make sure that my entire data set is set up properly and that I'm going to be able to trust the results of my GLMs. So I tend to call these control analyses. I don't know that there's a proper term, but it's basically a positive control is a strong effect that has to actually be there. So for example, and to then look if it's there. So one of my favorites for this is button pressing, because since we do task fMRI, people are usually pushing response buttons. So I know when every single participant actually pushed a button, and I know where the left motor, where in left motor the finger is. So if I can't do a contrast of button push, not button push, and see motor, something went wrong. And also, if you can't see that, if I can't find button pushing, should I believe some sort of Sternberg length effect related to motivation in the, if you can't find motor and you're looking for something subtle, I wouldn't believe anything subtle if you can't see the control, I guess is what I'm getting at. So I really do think of this as a necessary first step. You can usually find visual something to use as one of these. That's what I was just saying. So, this is just a picture of one of these from one of our standard files of a single subject. And the colors are kind of lousy, but you can see that, yeah, that does look like motor in this single subject GLM. So here's kind of the thing, is that using these controls can be, I was saying, a really positive test. So this is another view of one of them. We're running FIR tent models. It doesn't really matter. But this is a parcel average for a single subject off of these button pushes. And the point is what I had highlighted here, that these are 3 separate tasks and actually on 3 separate sessions. So, and in each one, at this sort of time that I highlighted, it goes up. The coefficients increase in this sensible motor region. And that's what it should be. That's the button pushing. But for this part of this automatically generated knitter, which was made from one of these templates I talked about, to look like this, that means that my R code must have found the GLM output that AFNI, in our case we're using AFNI, so it was able to find the statistics objects from AFNI, find the correct fields in them, pull out those images. Well, and that must mean that the AFNI script's finished, because otherwise I wouldn't have the AFNI output. And that must mean that the event onsets were right, because if the events weren't there, then the AFNI wouldn't have run. And also, if it wasn't able to find the button pushes out of the E prime, then the button pushes would not have been aligned enough to make this little blurb in the motor area at the button times, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I can do this whole logic of all of these steps had to have been completed in order for me to get this picture. And I could do similar arguments about some of the other parts, but this to me is actually the big payoff here. That to set up a procedure that allows you to make this kind of chain of logic. I'm not relying on, okay, hopefully, did the grad student, to be mean, click around a couple times until he managed to get found the one that looks like motor. I know that, and I'm seeing nods. Some of you guys know the kind of phenomenon. If you know what it's supposed to look like, you can kind of poke around a little bit to try to make sure you have it. But with this kind of setup, you can set it up to actually, it's not that it's all black box, but it's that you can set up some of this logic. So to kind of try to wrap it up, I was thinking that the goal of dataset QC is to verify that the contents match its description, something that has to be true in the very broad sense and kind of the quality assurance sense of Pradeep's for the data set to be usable. And I'm trying to give the argument that it's not something that we just do at the very end, but it has to be rather woven into all of the stages with these checklists, scripts, standard operating procedures, all of this to really try to increase the chances that we're going to get a workable, usable data set out at the end. And the consequences are not really as obvious and severe as for a failed parachute, but they are really serious. I've been in projects that have been derailed because the errors were found late. In one case, it was fraud. Another case, there was unacceptable movement, really bad artifacts. This kind of stuff has happened. I would imagine a lot of you have been involved in projects that years of data collection were just tossed because it wasn't usable. And even if you can try to pull something out, it can be really hard. And there's no perfect solution, nothing that's going to guarantee a flawless data set, but we want to do this environment to try to minimize errors and catch them quickly. So that's it. Oh, and nobody flagged me down, so I actually went a bit long now that I'm looking at the time. So if somebody has a really urgent question, otherwise I guess we just have to wait till the end to try to keep on schedule. So, thanks.
Okay. If there are no questions, we can advance to next talk by Professor Alexander Leemans on diffusion weighted MRI.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to give this talk. So, can I see some hands? Who of you is familiar with doing diffusion MRI analysis? Great. Okay, the majority. So, today we're going to talk about how you identify and correct physiological and systematic artifacts, and I actually want to start with how a typical day in my case looks like. Okay, so this is me. Okay, I'm the physicist. I'm the nerd in the lab, if you want. And here's the rich and handsome Dr. Bob. And he steps into my office and he says, "Hey, Alex, I've been collecting advanced DTI data. Can you help me with the analysis?" And obviously the little star says like, "Well, can you do the analysis for me?" Which is fine. Every person has their own skill set. And so we're there to facilitate them, right? I work in a medical facility. And so when he says like, "Wow, advanced DTI data," I'm already thinking like, wow, high quality, HEP quality kind of data. And in practice, he shows me one data set. I'm getting really sad, as you can see. And then he's even bragging about, "Well, I collected 300 data sets." I'm like, so it's a bit depressing. And so the point I want to make is if you look at an entire diffusion MRI pipeline, well, we acquire our data and people start using some model, let's say DTI, do some analysis approach like tractography to get your statistical inferences. Well, it's this step which is typically neglected, right? They acquire data and bam, they start analyzing. But that's kind of not really what you should do. You should look at your data quality first, right? And so I asked 18 different centers across the world to send me their typical data set. And you all know what that means, right? Their typical data sets, probably their best quality data set they've ever acquired, just not to lose face. But look at this. I mean, what is this? Is that human? I was like, what is that, a pineapple? I mean, so I was a bit amazed by the diversity in quality. And so let's go over a few of them. So let's start with this one, okay? So let's focus on this one. Let's zoom in. Just shout. I mean, this is a small room. We can make it interactive. So shout if you spot something abnormal. Right? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, exactly. So the color convention is typically green front to back, red left, right, blue up, down. And I was actually amazed to see that, it was actually quite silent. And I was like, do I see any artifact? But you were not focusing on the color. So if you focus now on the correct one, well, it's a huge difference, right? So the convention was not conventional. I mean, the convention of the color encoding was not normally, right? So here you can see some pyramidal pathways, corticospinal tracts going, obviously up, down, but colored in green. So that's green is front to back. Is that wrong? Well, no, it's a convention, right? At some point, people decided, let's do red, left, right. So it's not wrong per se. However, if you were to look at the actual orientations of your first eigenvector, so the dominant orientation from the diffusion tensor, then even when you do have the correct color encoding, it can still be wrong. So this is correct, but this is wrong. I mean, that happens, and especially in a context of a multi-center study, different software packages, different conventions on coordinate systems, then things can get complicated quite easily. And some of these artifacts, they do creep in, right? And you have to keep in mind with diffusion MRI, you're looking basically at two coordinate systems. We've got our spatial coordinate system, right? The way our head is positioned in the scanner. But if you're doing an eigenvalue decomposition to get information about the ellipsoid, like shape and orientation, then that information is also in its own coordinate system. That's basically what a principal component analysis and an eigenvalue decomposition is all about. You're changing your coordinate system such that the variance is minimized, or maximized along the axis, along your new coordinate system. Okay, so keep that in mind. Because if you don't, you get a very exciting Dr. Bob coming up to me saying like, hey, Alex, look at this stratigraphy. Wow. Look, no singulum bundles. Oh, we should write to science. We've got this unique subject. And I'm like, wow, yeah, indeed. Look at the here, the uncinate fasciculus. It's reversed. Look at this. And even the corticospinal tract, it's cut. Like the patient should not move anymore. But look at this. It's still moving. And another one which is convenient, like, hey, can he actually speak? No speech network here. Like, where's the arcuate fasciculus? So indeed, you think like, wow. But then it's like, okay, let's have a look at the data. And then if you correct for it, well, it looks a bit more what you expect. You see some singulum bundles. You see a lot more dense network what you expect. Okay. So luckily, there are tools available now that can do this automatically. There's one over here that basically just automatically checks like, okay, is this correct or not? Boom. So from a QA point of view, like Joe emphasized, it's important to put that in your pipeline to make sure like, okay, you're not making any errors there. Let's look at another one. Okay, so again, if you notice something peculiar, just give a shout. It's maybe a bit more complicated indeed, but if you're more familiar, you see something blue over here near the corpus callosum, and like, just doesn't look that clear. Well, in this case, if we actually were to make a quick movie loop of the raw data, and this is 60 slices, 60 directions, so you're looking at thousands of images, but you can look at them within 10 seconds, right? Just making a quick movie loop. And here you can already establish that, hey, there was a severe subject motion. Right? In this case, the patient, well, it wasn't the patient, it was a healthy volunteer, but she was not informed to lie still in the scanner. Well, that's problematic with MRI, right? So you're like, doing the whole shebang, and that's problematic, right? Do we need to throw away that data set? No. We can correct for that, and I'll come back to that later. But it's not just the movie loop. It's also looking at your data from different axis view. And by that, I mean if you acquire your data axially, then if you look at it coronally or sagittally, your brain is optimized for discontinuities. And obviously, if you go through this data set axially, you probably all spotted this kind of signal dropout, right? The entire slice would be gone. But did you notice this hyper-intense band of signal over here, right? I mean, when you look at it, you see it, but you need to look at it, right? And if you do it axially, going down, like, axial slice by slice, your brain automatically adapts the dynamic range in which you're looking for artifacts. You will never spot it, right? Especially because it's asymmetric as well. Like it's more over here. Here it's, I guess, okay. But this was a systematic artifact that was not captured in the entire cohort. So that's kind of painful. So anyway, the take-home message here is that if you're embarking on a diffusion study, just do a good, pilot study of 5 subjects or something like that. Doesn't take too much time, but really, hammer deep into the QA. And there's more to come, right? But this is just important. Look at your data from different views, not just the image plane in which your data was acquired. Okay, moving on to this one. Again, even less obvious what the artifact is. So I asked a few diffusion experts, like, what's the artifact? And it's like, well, I can't really say. Well, I have to say something about PIS here. I know I should have chosen the acronym more diplomatically, but the point I want to make is we don't want PIS in our data, okay? And so PIS stands for physically implausible signals. And so not a lot of equations, this is the only one. If you look at diffusion, our diffusion-weighted signal is always an attenuated version of our non-diffusion-weighted signal, right? Because we have some B value, some diffusion weighting that we apply. And e to the minus BD is always something which is smaller than 1. So by that rationale, our diffusion-weighted signal is always lower than our non-diffusion-weighted signal, right? I mean, there's phase dispersion, diffusion, so signal is low. That's what we expect. However, we do find areas in the brain where our diffusion-weighted signal is larger than the corresponding non-diffusion-weighted signal. And to me, that's physically implausible, right? So that signal is called PIS. Okay, let's go back to this one and overlay PIS on an FA map. Okay, so I'm just flagging regions where there was a non-diffusion-weighted signal that was lower than a diffusion-weighted signal. Okay, so if you know that, let's look at the data then, like the raw data. And let's focus on these voxels, 4 voxels for simplicity, okay? So here on a non-diffusion-weighted signal, you can see the same 4 voxels, and they're indeed very dark, right? And it seems to be like near CSF regions that you see these kind of dark voxels. So what is that? What is that artifact? Well, the artifact is named after this guy. Okay, does anybody know who he is? No? Well, it's an old guy, as you can see from the picture, but, well, he doesn't live anymore, but his name is Mr. Gibbs. And everybody knows about Gibbs rimming, not rimming, sorry. Ringing. And so, just to get you all on board, Gibbs ringing is basically a concept that if you have insufficient high bandwidth data, like high frequency component, then you get this undershoot and overshoot when you're doing like a Fourier transform, the inverse Fourier transform. By the way, a kind of interesting note, Gibbs, Einstein called him the smartest guy he ever met. So he must be a really smart guy. Anyways, so let's focus again on the data, okay? So now I'm showing you the color-encoded FA map alongside with the FA map, but then flagged with PIS on it. And as you can appreciate now, indeed you see this rim, dark rim due to Gibbs ringing. So any interface in your data where you have a kind of transition from a low signal to a very high signal, it means in a signal space, it's very steep going up, right? And so just before going up, you have this rippling going down, and then the overshoot in the CSF, right? So that's how you kind of have to visualize this. And then indeed, if you look back now, and you see where we have PIS, and in the corresponding regions, we see it's kind of hyper-intense FA values, then you know like, these estimates are not that good. I'm starting to feel uncomfortable by saying so many times PIS in my talk, but we're not in America, so okay. So anyway, here's a few examples where I'm going to show you where you can find them. So obviously, if you have let's say, people with a lot of atrophy, meaning there's a lot of CSF, a lot of high intensity values higher up in the brain, then you can clearly see that in the white matter, or even in the gray matter, you see these ripples going on, right? So I'm going to show you a few before and afters, because once we've identified the artifact, we can also do something about it. And by the way, you'll be surprised, knowing now of this PIS map and this Gibbs ringing. Look at your own data. It's very likely that you'll bump into this artifact. So anyway, so this is before correcting. I'll just show you after correcting first, before I explain how I do it. So before, after. So as you can appreciate, after, these kind of speckles, they go away, right? And I'm minimizing the effect of smoothing across boundaries, right? So you could argue, well, we solve Gibbs ringing by just smoothing. And yeah, you can do that. But obviously, smoothing, it's kind of 1980s. You kind of blur the image. Let's say your resolution goes down, like effective resolution. So you don't want to do that. So we used an off-the-shelf total variation filtering. It's kind of a fancy nonlinear filtering approach. But that approach was also, already existing in the 90s, right? So we didn't do anything new in terms of the methods development. We just found an easy way to fix it. And there's now more approaches how to deal with Gibbs ringing. Okay, let's move on to the next one. This one over here. Anything abnormal? that you can see? Well, might be difficult, but remember the color encoding? Red means left, right. Bright in the image means high FA, means a high structural coherent tissue organization that underlies the diffusion. Well, if you look at the bottom of the brain over here, we see this kind of red blob. And this is suggesting that there's a direct connection between the occipital poles. Well, it's very unlikely, but you never know, right? So how can I actually assess that this is an artifact and not something genuine, hyperplasticity thing, right? So to do that, you can look at the residuals from the model estimation. So what do I mean with that? I'll just give you a toy example. Let's assume I've got these points, X, Y, and these are my measurements, the yellow dots. And now let's assume we've got a model. And our model that tries to capture this relationship is a line, right? The simplest of models. We've got something that basically provides an estimate given some X, right? And the coefficients A and B, so the slope and the offset, these are our unknowns, right? So our model is characterized by two unknowns, the slope and the offset. Okay, so the residual now is basically these little white lines, meaning I'm looking at the difference between what I measured, the yellow dots, and what my model, the red line, predicts. Okay, so that's a residual. And we can do exactly the same with DTI, right? Think of it, DTI is a model. Keep in mind, we're measuring diffusion-weighted imaging data, but we're applying a model to those data, and then we call it DTI, right? So when you say, like, I acquired DTI data, well, I know what you mean, but you actually acquired DWI data and use DTI as a model, because nowadays there's hundreds of models, okay? So in this case, the model is DTI, the same as the slope, and the little white lines from the previous, toy example are basically the differences between the diffusion-weighted measurements and the diffusion-weighted signal as predicted by the diffusion tensor that we've estimated from our data, right? So the diffusion tensor is basically these 6 components. Think of the A and the B of the slope and the offset in the line model. So once you've estimated those, you can recompute what the diffusion-weighted signal should have been, subtract it from the measurements, right, the measured diffusion-weighted signals, and then you get this map. You can average them across all the diffusion-weighted orientations to be more sensitive to the map, and you'll end up with something like this. So the way I see this, this is a good quality example. You may argue, well, it's noisy. Well, we always have noise in our data, right? If you want less noise, take bigger voxels, right? But then you'll trade off resolution, right? So trade is the name of the game in MRI. So you can have high quality data, albeit noisy. The point I want to make here is that the residual map looks uniform, meaning everything which is left is basically the noise. So the residual map is now presenting you kind of everything which is kind of left over, which is in this case just the noise, assuming you have good quality data. So let's go back to this guy, where you have this kind of blob here. So how would the residual map look like? Well, there you go. You see this kind of light bulb effect. You clearly see an area here where it's quite high. So in this case, it was a vibration artifact causing this kind of pseudo high anisotropic region showing left-right connections. To correct for that, I'll refer to a nice paper from FEMRIP lab by Carla Miller, basically including a covariate to take into account this vibration artifact. Here's another one. And again, if you look at the data now, you can't even see the artifact, right? It's like the Gibbs ringing one. If you know it, you can go back and look at the PIS map and stuff. But here, you can hardly see it. Looking at the residual map, you can clearly see that there was this kind of ghost artifact, right? This fold over. So this is the fat in the neck, and if you don't apply enough fat suppression, you'll get this kind of rim in the data. And actually, looking back, you may argue, well, I do see a bit of dark band over here, but that's self-fulfilling prophecy, right? You couldn't spot that beforehand, really. And a final example showing the residual map and what it can do is, well, I'm actually showing you the residual map now, and if I ask you, what's the artifact? Oh, there's actually no artifact in the data. And then you're like, what? What have you been telling me now? Residual map artifacts? Well, there's a flip side to the coin, meaning on the one hand, residuals say something how well your model predicts your data, right? So if you have a data artifact, then your model is not going to give you a small result. It'll be big, sure. You'll get an artifact. However, What about the model? Maybe the model is wrong, right? So this would be the analogy. If you have this set of yellow measurements, then yes, this green line is probably a good model to describe the relationship. A sinusoid would not be a good model, right? So in this case, with the bad model, the sinusoid, you'll get a lot of large residuals, right? So looking back at this image, the data was perfect, no artifacts. But it was acquired with a very high B value. And in diffusion MRI, if you acquire data with higher B values, you will start to not probe the hindered diffusion regime, but the restricted diffusion regime, meaning that your Gaussian assumption that underlies DTI will not be valid anymore. So in these regions, there was a lot of restricted diffusion. So the diffusion tensor was not coping with the behavior that the data was showing. Does that make sense? So, so on the one hand, residuals say something about data quality, assuming your model is right. But if you're violating your model assumptions and the data is good, it'll also indicate regions where, your model was not good. And going back to this one, these are regions with crossing fibers. And you may have heard of crossing fibers. It's basically indicating that you have, within a voxel, multiple fiber populations. So that's something that you cannot capture with a diffusion tensor, which is only limited to showing one dominant orientation of diffusion. Okay? So anyway, it's kind of a convenient way to look at either data quality or model quality. And just to drive this point home, I think most of you know Russ Poldrack, a famous neuroscientist in Stanford. And he scanned his own brain for a year or even longer. Maybe he's still doing it, I don't know. Probably, knowing him. Anyway, at some point he asked me to analyze his diffusion data, and so I looked at the data and I saw this kind of green patch in the middle over here. And so I was like, oh, is that an artifact in the data? No, it can't be, right? Good quality data, good QA. And so I looked at the residual map, right? That's the first thing I do. Is it an artifact? So if I were to look at this region in a residual map, I would expect to see structure in my residual map highlighting this area. But I couldn't, right? Okay? I checked, which B values, and I took the B1000 value regime for being within DTI limits, etc. So I was like, this is genuine, right? And so, I told him, like, hey, are you aware that you've got a special brain? So yeah, he has got this kind of what we would call maybe a hyperplasticity or an unusual configuration of anterior, posterior pathways smack in the middle of the corpus callosum. By the way, this is not like partial voluming with like the fornix below or cingulum bundle above. No, this is middle of the corpus callosum. So anyway, take-home message, QA of diffusion, and this is mainly at the stage of looking at your data and looking at the residuals. And both are kind of qualitative, but you can further standardize this. But it's very important to do it, especially if you're embarking on a new study. Make sure you do a few pilots. Okay, and then I want to continue with a few pre-processing steps. And let me start with a confession. A confession by a famous diffusion MRI scientist. Okay, can you put the audio on, please? Sir, in the back, have you got the audio on? Yeah, okay, let's try that again. Okay. Okay, it's on.
Thing is, this is very difficult for me. It's the first time I've spoken about this. The thing is, I've got these diffusion weighted data and I have to analyse them for a project. And all I've got is this black box. And I have no idea whatsoever what it is doing. There's all these questions. Do you want to rotate the B matrix? Do you want to modulate the intensity by the determinant of the Jacobian? What regression routine do you want? Ordinary least squares, weighted linear least squares, restore, whatever. Thing is, I just don't know. I need help. I need lots of help. And I need it now.
Oh, the poor thing, poor thing. So obviously this scientist likes to remain anonymous, so if you know who is, do not spread the word. So the point I want to make here is that there's many processing steps involved, many questions that you need to answer, and it's like in modeling, right? You've got all these different diffusion models, and you need to be aware of the assumptions, and you need to be happy with some assumptions that may be valid in your application, right? And so there's many tools out there, many processing steps that you can do, and I'll go over a few of them. And the first one is correcting for signal drift. And I'm thinking that, you know, this crowd is very fMRI infused, so you know about signal drift in fMRI data. Well, in diffusion MRI data, it has been neglected for years and years. People didn't notice why, because when you acquire data, typically you acquire, you know, in the beginning was maybe 1 or 2 non-diffusion weighted images, and then a bunch of diffusion weighted images which had different orientations, meaning different contrasts, so you could not really spot the drift in the data. But nowadays we acquire multiple B0 images, also interleaved between all the other diffusion weighted images, meaning that if you were to plot them just visually, you can visually see that, well, you know, it's not maybe clear to see on the screen, but the intensity goes down, and it's because your scanners are not perfect. They've got character, right? They heat up and they get mad and brr, and then signal goes down and up and down. So, and with the diffusion weighted signal, that's also the case, but it's less apparent, okay? So if I just take the average signal intensity of the non-diffusion weighted images, you'll get something like this over time, right? And this is an example where the gradient was really pushed to the limit in terms of you know, the specs that were you know, given. So this is maybe 10% signal drift, but you know, in practice, you know, 3, 4, 5% occurs in data, right? So this is the non-diffusion weighted signal. The little diamonds, you see, you know, like 3 apparent rows. These are 3 different B values. So the top row would be like the diffusion weighted signal for a B value of 1,000, where indeed visually you can also appreciate that it's actually going down a bit, less apparent with B2,000, B3,000, but it's still there. And so to correct for that, and that's trivial, and that's what fMRI people have been doing for a long time, is, well, put it in the model, right? Well, in this case with diffusion MRI, you basically fit a low order polynomial to your, you know, non-diffusion weighted signal, and once you have this trend, you can detrend it, right? It's quite simple. If you've got like legacy data with only 1 B0 image, you can also apply this technique on the B1000 images, or if you have a higher B value, you know, up to 2000, it's still okay. If you go higher, then obviously, if you remember, higher B values means lower signal. You might be dropping towards the noise floors, so what you end up with is just noise, and then you don't see the drift anymore, right? But up to you know, B value to even 2000, it's fine. Okay, so how does it affect your data? Well, this is before, this is after. I'll quickly toggle between them, so hopefully you can see a difference. If you don't, well, I'll just show you the difference map and, you know, show you the percentage difference. And to our amazement, even the vast majority is above the typical effect size that you see in, you know, in diffusion MRI studies, right? So this is something to be aware of as well. But the good news is you can't, you know, really do anything wrong correcting for it if there's no artifact, because it's just an offset. Then there's correcting for subject motion. This is our subject again that was not informed to lie still in the scanner. Well, we can correct for that easily by using registration-based tools, image registration, to correct for that. One thing which is different compared to fMRI data is that, well, our data now contains orientation-dependent data. So if you lie in the scanner differently due to subject motion, well, if you then correct for it, you should also correct the orientation aspect. And the toy example that kind of explains this is that if I need to reorient this subject over here, I can do it and get this. But now the orientation information needs to be reoriented as well. And that's what we mean with rotate the B matrix, because that captures information about the orientation information there. And simultaneously, we correct for eddy currents. I once made the mistake to tell a healthy volunteer, like, "Ah, look, and here's your brain stretching and compressing due to eddy currents." It's like, "Oh my God, MRI can't be safe, right?" I'm like, no, sorry. I mean the data. It's the data of your brain. It's not your brain that is stretching. So anyway, if you don't correct for it, you get the bright rims. If you do correct for it, they're gone. So that's your telltale sign, like, okay, things are going the right way. And you can further evaluate it with the residual maps, because they also will highlight these rims of high residuals. And then there's the EPI deformations, another one. This is also related to geometric, fidelity issues. So let's assume that this T1 weighted image has a high geometric fidelity, and you were to rigidly align your diffusion data to your T1 and overlay them like this, then you can see that, hey, here in the corpus callosum, the diffusion data seems to be stretched to the front, while the back is kind of okay. So if I overlay the edge information of the FA in red on top of the T1, the back looks fine, but the front looks, kind of weird. And that's because it's highly nonlinear, right? So you can't really deal with that from an affine or rigid point of view. You need, more elastic registration approaches to do that. So I'm just going to show you again before and after. So this is without correction. So this is rigidly aligned. And this is aligned properly with the EPI deformation. And then people say, like, well, you're showing a region in the orbitofrontal cortex. It's renowned for these kind of artifacts. Higher up in the cortex, we don't see it. Well, if you go higher up in the cortex, you may say, like, well, it's good alignment, but it can be better. So this is before, this is after. Okay, so definitely an improvement. And the trick to doing this with an image registration-based approach is basically you can constrain the bleep out of it by just looking at what are my degrees of freedom of the deformation. And in this case, it's along the phase encode orientation, right? So, so what you can do then is say, like, okay, let's constrain all these degrees of freedom for unwarping the deformation in that image plane. And so if I now show it from a sagittal point of view, you'll understand this. This is before correction, after. Okay? So you can appreciate that the deformation is only in the front-back orientation, right? And so that makes it kind of easier to come up with the global optimum for alignment. Okay, and then there's a lot of nice work from the FSL people. Jesper Anderson is pioneering this, basically integrating both subject motion, eddy currents, EPI distortion, and even doing this all on the fly while correcting for diffusion motion artifacts. So a lot of improvement in recent years there. And finally, I would like to say something about the diffusion model estimation approaches. Well, again, look at the residuals. In this case, you would say, like, okay, good quality data, but what if you have an outlier due to subject motion or pulsation artifacts? Well, in this case, from a statistical point of view, it's kind of trivial, right? It's an outlier. We have many tools to do that. We look at the interquartile range, look how many times it's beyond this confidence interval, and then say, like, okay, it's an outlier. Sure. If you don't do that, then your ordinary linearly square, which is typically what most packages use or what the scanner console provides you, it'll be biased towards the outlier, and you'll get a poor estimate. However, when you do take care of the outlier, you identify it, get rid of it, and then estimate your model with the remaining points, we'll call it robust estimation, you can get quite decent results, right? And in the olden days, it just took too long to compute, right? It was like tenfold or even longer compared to an ordinary linearly square. So nobody did it because, a doctor, probably will wait for 3 minutes because he can get a cup of coffee, comes back, and it's done. But longer, it's not usable, right? So a lot of effort has been put into optimizing speed, and now it's kind of routine to use it. So here was an old case. This is what the scanner console provided. It was a child with a lesion, moving a lot of artifacts. Obviously, I kind of cherry-picked my axial slice over here, but if I then correct it, instead of using an ordinary linear square, but with a robust estimator, I'll get this, right? So hopefully you can appreciate that this one looks a lot better than this one, okay? Okay, finally, I want to thank my collaborators. Many people have contributed to this work. I also want to emphasize that, the tools that I've shown in this talk are with Explore ETI, and if you want to learn about it, we're having another workshop in Costa Rica. Could think of worse places to visit. End of this year. So if you want, we can talk about this. But most importantly, it's the people of the team, right? They do all the hard work, and I'm just here presenting their work, to be honest. So I want to thank all these people in my lab. And I would like to thank you for your attention. Thanks. I'm also happy to take any questions now or later in the discussion. So, one quick question, yeah. Could you speak up a bit? I'm an old man, so.
Can you comment on like what your standard check you would go through? Say you're collecting 100 DPS subjects. You talked about a lot of different things we should be looking for. What's the quickly algorithm?
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of checking everything, right? So each of these steps can be fully automated, right? But intermediate between these steps, I would check, right? So for instance, the signal drift, right? If you're saying like, I'm gonna do signal drift automatically, fully, default settings, well, if you only have one B0 image, it will not work, right? So then you need to define which B value. And obviously that part can also be scripted, but sometimes it's kind of complicated with which type of data you have and have the data been ordered or reordered in a different way. So each of these steps is fully automated, and the ones that I presented, like signal drift, again, Gibbs ringing, optional, right? Because you may not have Gibbs ringing, then don't do it. If you don't have any signal drift, the good thing is applying the signal drift doesn't do anything harmful, because then the actual drift will be the unity line, right? So that's fine. So I always do signal drift correction, because it also gives me information about percentage drift, etc. And then, there's always subject motion, especially nowadays, because our acquisitions with diffusion can tend to be a bit longer, right? Because we acquire more data, especially in neuroimaging dedicated centers. There's always a slight residual eddy currents, because you can have the twice refocused gradients, but there's always a bit of stretching going on or skews. The EPI distortions, especially to go into higher field strength, they become more pronounced, so we also include that. And then, by default, use a robust estimator, because if there's no outliers, well, it will estimate with all the data, and that's fine too. So these are the typical steps that we do. And then obviously this is purely, from a QA point of view, topic of this session. But if you want to do analysis, sometimes you can further optimize your pre-processing in the context of your analysis. Like, hey, go to some template space while doing correction for subject motion, because you don't want to resample your data again and again and again, because you get kind of smoothing effects, right? So ideally you want to concatenate all these transformation matrices together to go into one space, or final space, whatever. So there's unfortunately no free lunch in diffusion anyway, so you can also like press a button and here's my paper. Okay? Okay, yeah, thank you very much.
So as I mentioned at the beginning, we unfortunately do not have one of the scheduled speakers, Stephen Strother, who is supposed to talk about exciting multi-site, multi-scanner QA and QC. So I'll be finishing the course with a talk focused on tools and informatics. In fact, that question was a perfect segue to my talk. So the answer to the question in my mind was better tools. Automatic when possible, but even if it's semi-automatic or manual, if it's focused on making the burden a little less, I think it can go a really long way in terms of actually speeding it up or scaling it up for larger data sets, right? That's the thrust of what I'm going to try to convey here. So, I guess I went ahead of myself. Manual QC does not scale, time-consuming, costly. For example, if you needed to employ experts, and it's actually error-prone, even for people who are pretty familiar with the data, depending on the time of the day and the caffeine level, for example, and even for small samples. So tools are really, really important to improve reproducibility as well as improve harmonization across various aspects. But before I go on about how important they are, I want to remind people that there are dangers of automation, as you may have guessed. They can be black boxes, we have seen in the confession now. Uh, and sometimes the people just don't understand what's happening, right? So we have to keep this in mind before we go charging fully towards automation. And actually, for this particular QA QC aspect, they are not sufficiently accurate. At least in few of the applications I've been involved in, some of them are just not there, and they can really help with very subtle issues. So this talk, I was hoping to give a quick summary of a large number of very QC QA tools that are available. We can't cover them all in detail because they go across diverse and disparate set of topics, and in fact, I don't know too much about them except for what they do. I'm just trying to present summaries, hoping to make it easy for other people interested in particular modality or application. You don't have to worry getting the details. All the tools, most of the tools are already summarized in this website of the Neuroimaging Quality Control Special Interest Group. We hope to keep it dynamic and live as it goes through the process. So here we go. So I want to summarize these tools into use cases and by modality when possible. So for example, when I say multimodal, I mean a tool that can help with different applications across multiple modalities, not necessarily combining, and sometimes it could be combining too. And for T1 weighted MRI, for example, for visual quality control, you might have seen I mentioned one of my tools. It's called Visual QC. And for automatic QC, especially to scale for thousands and thousands of scans, the task is typically say, is this particular T1 weighted scan from subject 1 or 123 usable or not? And there are tools like MRI QC and Koala T, I guess it's supposed to be pronounced as quality, that can help you compute quality scores directly from T1 weighted scan without any intervention based on various image quality metrics or post-processing data. And the another QC use case I touched on in the first talk is freezer for pastillation accuracy, and there are multiple tools to make that process really easy, including protocols from Enigma Consortium, an app called Mind Control, which is in a web interface. Visual QC also helps with that, and a QC app from Roberto Toro that can make this process really easy. And to check the accuracy, anatomical accuracy of volumetric segmentations, tools like BrainBox and Visual QC are really, really helpful. And as I mentioned before, alignment checks can be really easily done at scale with Visual QC. There is some tool called PALS, which can really help with QC specific to stroke or lesions 1, which needs even more customized version of QC because you're really looking into many more issues here. And for functional MRI, for visual QC, for example, is Dash QC, some scripts from AFNI called AFNI Pros. MRI QC is an excellent tool that does a lot of batch processing as well as image quality metrics and reports. And for single subject or single session of MRI visual inspection, especially if you want to look into dive deep into the carpet plots or individual time points or various metrics overlaid on these particular time points, visual QC is a good way to approach it too. And a lot of this involves actually generating and visualizing image quality metrics such as SNR, CNR, FWHM, and many other library of metrics. And Dash QC from Pierre Belec is also a really good way to approach this. MRI QC also does some of this. And yeah, for diffusion MRI, as you have just heard from Professor Leemans, Explore DTI is a great tool. And there's also a tool from FSL called Reddy QC, which is a bit more batch processing oriented that can help with single subject as well as group data set QC. For real-time functional MRI, real-time QC of functional MRI, there is this tool called RTQC from Stefan Hunis and team from South Africa. That's actually helps with a lot of aspects related to this. And for arterial spin labeling, explore ASL, which I'm going to get into later on. And scanner and hardware specific QC is a tool called InUQC that tries to make this complicated task really easy. And more importantly, as we've talked about, as the data sets are getting bigger and bigger, we cannot do this all in a lab, even with tools, so crowdsourcing is going to be even more important, not only to reduce the burden, but also to improve harmonization, so to say. And Binder and MRI-QC are a few ways to attack some specific aspects of this problem. So I want to spend a little more time on visual cues. The task for automatic classification is typically something like this. You know, you have an input scan. You want to be able to quickly say, you know what, this is unusable. This is the major task. And this particular focus is appealing in a lot of QC aspects because people don't have the resources or time or interest to perform this. So automatic is better, provided if it's sufficiently accurate. For example, the ghosting artifact is very easy to be detected, or the severe ringing here, but not actually have false positive, right? So we want to be able to classify this as okay, or detect inhomogeneity really well, right? So often these tools cannot correct them, except in very basic situations. So in order to perform this visual quality control of T1 weighted MRI, this is the interface I came up with, which makes it really easy to see if there are some big issues in a collage point of view, which is highly extensible and customizable, and you can zoom anywhere to make the process easy, so you don't have to switch between a lot of tools. And you can rate a number of you can rate it with a number of artifacts and terms and free-form nodes. I hope you can see it on the right. And the idea is to generate ground truth from these detailed review. Instead of just trying to look at only 3 or 4 slices, we look at as much data in as different ways, including distributions of various metrics, to provide a rating that can be treated as ground truth, which is actually quite important for many different tasks of QA, especially if you want to build predictive models that can detect these, right? So you need ground truth. So, and some sort of outlier help. Oh, there's something wrong. You know, the pace map is too large in this data, for example, is one way to alert. You know, this. So that could really help speed up this process, because what happens is as we go through this, people are not paying enough attention. So some sort of guidance is really helpful. And in fact, this includes options such as I am tired. So you don't want to be rating when you're tired and you move on and get back to it. This point is important because people don't often realize this when they are rating, right? So, so the next tool I want to quickly summarize is MIQC, which is an excellent tool actually for various reasons. The primary purpose I think it's used at this point is automatic classification of scans, either low quality or acquisition issues with T1 weighted MRI and fMRI. And it's extending quality assessment protocol published by Cameron Craddock and colleagues back in the day. And it's actually very well implemented, integrates super nicely with BIDS format, where Paul Racklab is leading this, and very easy to use on Open Neuro, especially if you have functional data set and T1 data sets in BIDS format or as a command line app. We can't go into details on everything it does, but take a look. For example, it also produces a lot of reports on image quality metrics, which can be helpful in detecting outliers and are getting back to some interesting subjects in a big group, for example. As I mentioned, Koala T is another app that can compute scores for a given T1 weighted MRI scan and visualize the whole data set to help you quickly pick out bad scans, or at least semi-automated effort to reduce the QC burden, so you can only look at few of them instead of having to go through everything. I mentioned visual QC freezer for before. The purpose of these customized and integrated tools is to reduce the QC burden, right? So for example, by giving you a full collage overview and ability to zoom in wherever you want to, if you spot some mistakes, or removing surface overlays, or for example, zooming in the full surface visualizations would make the process super easy, which otherwise is quite hectic and time consuming, and sometimes erroneous because you're switching between a lot of tools, right? So in fact, I have a poster on this tomorrow or Wednesday showing that this particular protocol produces much less false positives with higher error detection rate compared to Enigma protocol. And yeah, so this is the Enigma protocol I was just mentioning. This protocol, I think, was originally developed with a focus on achieving reasonable quality assessment, but at scale, at like thousands and thousands of scans. It works reasonably well for certain aspects, and it's actually adopted in Enigma consortium. It can be really helpful to inform other more comprehensive workflows. As you might have seen this in first talk, Visual QC can really help with checking alignments across modalities and various aspects really quickly. And Mind Control is another app for visual quality control. Takes a different approach where we start with the distributions from entire data sets and focus on outliers, or focus on a particular ROI you might be interested in, and then zooming into the particular subject that might be cause of concern in various ways. By linking descriptive metrics, imaging viewer, editor, and annotation, especially if you want to quickly edit an error in ASEG or apart plus ASEG, it can be done. And because of its design, it makes it really easy to collaborate and be used in various ways. Note, I put links to the original tool or data whenever possible, so when you get the slides, you can always dig in later. There's another similar app is called QC app from Robert Totoro, Katya, Hure, and team. This is more focused on quicker assessment of segmentation accuracy, for example, in this case, cerebellum. And on the left, you can see the whole data sets, and you can quickly look and rate the particular subject in a way and move on. And BrainBox is another tool that makes collaborative volumetric editing really, really easy. This is an excellent tool because you can real-time collaborate on the internet and produce really high-quality neuroanatomical segmentation, right? So because this is a time-consuming and tough process, such collaboration is kind of important to get high-quality segmentations. Another way to do this, if you are not really producing atlases, but actually looking at hundreds of subjects in a data set and also multiple structures, is via Visual QC that can really make this process easy. And AFNI proc, going into functional MRI now, AFNI processing scripts actually now have some QC capabilities, producing images into your web page that you can scroll through and try identify outliers based on customized QC visualizations. It produces various different plots to help with functional MRI QA QC. This is followed by Dash QC, like I mentioned, focuses on visualizing image quality metrics that can directly linking them to the particular subject reports, helps with checking alignment between EPI and T1, for example, which are important. And like I mentioned, MRI QC does a lot of functional MRI QC too. Excellent tool, you must take a look. And visual QC also help with this, but here the focus is in individual bold volume, right? So what you see here on the as a carpet, it's actually called carpet plots. Some of you might be familiar with it. That plots time points on the x-axis and the voxel on the y-axis. This particular type of visualization of 4D data in a 2D plane makes it easy to pick up any major artifacts such as motion and a few other spikes, for example. And I don't know if you can see the colors. I overlaid some of the per time stats on in 3 different panels: top, middle, and the bottom. The top is the main bold signal at each time point, and the bottom is the standard deviation of the bold signal. The bottom is DVARS, is a specific metric which is very useful to for QA, QC, or functional MRI. So the reason this is laid out in this particular manner is to pick out outliers quickly, like the outliers we saw in the diffusion MRI talk. If you see something really dropping down, at the right hand quadrant, you can see one black band from top to bottom. That's where some issues are, for example, and I quickly rate it. And this also helps you to zoom in to that particular bold volume, if that would help you get more confidence into assessment of what it is, right? So this is obviously not enough to tell, right? Just a single voxel value, right? So you have to look at the full 3D volume to assess its quality, right? And it can do a lot more things. The idea is to make comprehensive review of the data really easy with a visual QC, right? So next, jumping into diffusion MRI QC now is a tool called Eddy QC from FSL group, which really helps assessing at the single subject as well as the group level. QC metrics are derived through different stages of FSL pre-processing pipelines, and primarily focusing on trying to differentiate between good and bad quality scans quickly, and also to reduce the QC burden by identifying problematic scans that you can actually spend more time on. And as we learned from Professor Leemans on Explore DTI for exploratory diffusion MRI and fiber tractography, that includes a lot of QA, QC, and some PIS maps, I believe. So as another another tool in this space is DTI Prep, which takes a very similar approach to QC, like Eddy QC and Explore DTI. It's an open source tool. You can learn more about it online. So processing, model estimation, looking at residuals and other proxies for quality. So just like functional MRI, visual QC helps you go through diffusion MRI data also, because both are 4D data instead of time point. This is actually wrong graphic, I'll correct it. It should be gradient along the x-axis, and we can overlay diffusion MRI specific metrics here, which can help you quickly rate the quality or make some notes. So for comprehensive assessment, this makes the process easy, and you can also zoom into different volumes as you wish. So now jumping into special types of modalities, which is, for example, real-time functional MRI here. RTQC toolbox helps with a large number of aspects related to the quality control. I'm not an expert on this particular modality, but I hope you can go to the website and get more details into this. But I guess it also has, it takes the same approach as many other tools to provide customized visualizations with focus on assessing the quality and producing reports and a regressor for denoising, for example. And for ASL, arterial spin labeling modality, there is a toolbox. In fact, this is a great community effort that are trying to build a collaborative framework that facilitates cross-pollination between methods, image processing methods people and clinical investigators to try improve the quality of ASL analyses. If you are into these applications, please take a look. And this is actually quite an outlier in this space too, because this toolbox helps you with very specific scanner and hardware related QC, especially when you have a multi-echo or when you have the number of dimensions greater than 4. MATLAB based toolbox which build custom data structures and frameworks for fast switching between image operations and visualizations, for example, and it does integrate with SPM well. You want to take a look. Remember the overview picture I gave you, QC is not just in the image that is produced, but there is a bigger scope to it. So you want to think about this, QC into the acquisition processes, and the image are also combining across multi-site. And the last aspect I want to quickly describe is crowdsourcing in the QC aspect. Like I mentioned, scale of the neuroimaging studies is growing rapidly, and I think it's only going to grow. That means QC burden grows exponentially too. You cannot rely on experts for QC on, like, let's say 50,000 or 100,000 images, right? So you must go beyond the lab to achieve high quality QC on this. So crowdsourcing is a way to try break the task down into simpler QC tasks that can be offhanded to citizen scientists, so to say. Grinder is an attempt in that direction, for example, to assess the quality of quality of the input T1 weighted images, for example, or stroke, the accuracy of lesion segmentation, right? So I don't mean to imply that this is perfect for all QC applications. In fact, I don't think so, because this certain aspects of the QA QC requires a lot of training and familiarity with the data. But for certain simple applications, for example, distinguishing between good quality T1 MRI on the left and very bad scan on the right, I think it can be done by most reasonable people if you train them well. In fact, that's what this app tries to do. Show them some examples before and test their ability to distinguish between issues using ground truth. As they reach a certain level of familiarity and accuracy, you can actually let them to go on rating actual images. And this process is gamified to improve engagement, to get more people joining in. And if you have a large number of ratings for an image, which is rated as, for example, bad, it's more likely that it's bad, and it really helps improve the scale. Yeah, like I said, it's gamified, which is actually a pretty good idea. So this is by no means a comprehensive summary. I believe there is more tools out there. We really tried hard to get input from the community to try let them tell us what they have done, so we can maintain a collection and people are aware of this. So if you are thinking about either using or to contribute to one of these toolboxes, I have some personal advice. This is not official from the special interest group or whatever. My suggestion is to ask really detailed questions on what these tools does before you go on from designing and planning large number of studies and whatnot. You might be surprised that about what they do and what they don't. You don't want to make plans on this before you get it. Play with it. And like I said, you know your problem best. Although I try to cover many modalities with visual QC based on my own understanding, it really requires collaborations with domain experts who actually know the problem better to improve it, right? So if you think that there's a particular issue that's not handling, you could try solve it yourself. But I would highly, highly recommend try not reinventing the wheel. It's a wasted effort. It's not worth it. Contributing to open source tools is the way to go. But don't compromise on the quality, because you know your problem best. So it's a little game. So try to spend time, and also even correcting the documentation and helping improve the quality of information on the quality control tools also helps a lot. So with that, I want to thank you and happy to take questions. Any questions? Don't be shy. Felix.
I believe some tools are better for one or the other application, and maybe they're taking up different attributes of the images. And I think the combination of certain tools are pretty interesting. But I don't know all of them. I use one or the other for one or the other thing. But that's just a comment. Have a look at what they actually detect and combine them. I mean, look at them is one thing, but the magic thing, I think, know what they can do on that.
Yeah, I wanted to delve more deep into their design, technical architecture, and whatnot, and how to contribute. But that can take a long. It's only a half-a-day course. So many of these tools are developed by incredibly smart and people with professional software engineering skills, which means that even if that particular tool does not solve your problem on the face of it, you can always get the code or API or mix it up a little bit for your own case. In fact, I think they would be super happy that you would approach them with these ideas, because a lot of the times people have the burden is increased just because there's no communication. They try to use the wrong tool for a long time, just propagating bad practices, right? So just ask questions, get them to do what you want, even if they can't do it for you, at least lay out the problem so somebody else. There is like a tremendous amount of interest in the open science and open source community, especially at OHBM, who wants to solve good problems, right? So if you have a particular need, be loud, be repetitive. Just don't let them give you imperfect tool. I mean, it cannot be perfect, but don't compromise on the quality, like I said, right? So, any other quick questions? I think we have a few more minutes before we can begin the open panel discussion. Okay, excellent, thank you. So this leads into our, we don't have slides for open panel discussion. Yeah.
I think this is more just, this is just an open time for, all of us are right here, so if there's something you didn't get asked that you wanted to earlier. Yeah, some of us can, there's chairs there, chairs here.
Test.
Well, should I start out with my QA question?
Let's see if,
Well, I already opened the floor, but nobody's jumping.
why are you guys so shy?
Nobody's gonna answer that if they're actually shy. But, well, yesterday when Pradeep and I were kind of collecting notes and getting ready for the session, we actually had a bit of a thing. I was like, Pradeep, what's the use of all splitting this into quality assurance and quality control? Aren't you just adding more complexity to do we need this split? And he was saying that, oh no, it's useful to think of all the different processes. So I was thinking that may be a point to start with, of if anybody has an opinion of what we should even call this. Is this QA, QC split useful? Is it just adding it over baggage? Is that a boring question? Anybody have an opinion? No.
Maybe the speakers can start, yeah.
I'm not shy. Okay, is this on? Okay, so maybe it's a simple physicist view, but quality control or quality assessment. Well, for me, quality assessment is really assessing the quality, like checking the quality. Quality control is trying to maintain a good quality in your data, so have more control by integrating tools. But in, let's say, the corridor, we just call it QA, and then we all know what that means. But maybe there is a need to split it up. And sorry, my voice is left me. But yeah, any other comments?
Well, I was going to say, I should have called my talk quality assurance then, following your scheme.
I think Alex might have missed my talk where I try to distinguish them. In the engineering world, IEEE and ISO They go by QA is process oriented, they try prevent it, and QC is focusing on the final product. I think it's extremely useful to distinguish between them, even just for the sake of it. Especially, I mean, coming from software world, I think the way you approach them really helps, right? So, but at the same time, it's not a big deal if you mix them up, and some of them are not easily categorizable. So that's just my personal opinion. Maybe.
I just had another question quickly. It's maybe a really stupid one, but when you say artifact, how do you spell it? With an I or with an E?
I thought the E was British, I is
American?
American spelling. That's
Yeah? Okay. I learned something. Sorry for the quick intermezzo.
Yeah, go ahead.
In Joe's talk, one thing I thought was the checklist. I'm a huge advocate of advising researchers when they're doing practical scanning. And I always use aviation as the exact example we use where no matter how many times you do it, you want to cross-check. It's especially true in user-run scans, I think. So from a safety MRI standpoint as well, like if you have two people there cross-checking. I was wondering if any of you also uses checklists for doing your quality control at your imaging centers, and can think of ways, like places that would be useful to do just in terms of like overall scanner health, and the things you can do on a day-to-day basis with technologists or users.
well, I think he was actually asking the physicist, but I can say
Yeah, so I mean, at our centre, what we do is we don't do checklists for when people are scanning per se, apart from all of the safety aspects, and that is very heavily checklisted to have the proper processes in place. However, you're not allowed to scan unless you've already been a secondary scanner for another study. So that helps us to. So first of all, anyway, there's like the theoretical education of how to actually operate the scanner, how to behave in that environment, and so on, and how to check for data quality. But then, you know, seeing somebody actually do it is really important, I think. So at our centre, you wouldn't be allowed to operate the scanner as a primary user unless you'd already seen somebody else doing it, and that somebody else would be one of our imaging support team who are trained radiographers, basically. And that would be doing things like, for example, the online QA that I was showing earlier, or, you know, if it's any other type of data, showing them to load the data in as you've acquired it. I mean, it's really basic things, but, you know, you can have the possibility where people will be sitting there just having a chat and, you know, running the scans back to back because they're so used to them rather than actually looking at the data. And that's a real shame because, first of all, if you don't see it at the time, nothing you can do about it if it's ruined data. But second of all, if you look at it at the time after the first scan and you see, you know, that there's been a problem, you can again coach the participant, make sure that they understand that they can't do what Alex was showing earlier, you know, having a little look around and all the rest of it, and that's going to be a problem. So it's a lot about the education between both the operator and the participant who might not be familiar with the environment, you know. And there can be a lot of variability on that too, in fact. I mean, sometimes you get people who just really know how to be scanned effectively, you know, and stay really still and do a great job, but that might be the kind of person you're using for your piloting, and it might be very different to the actual study case. And you need to make sure that obviously it's the study that really counts in terms of getting high quality.
this isn't a sales pitch exactly, but we use Basecamp. So I don't, so we're mentioning the checklists, and so we use the checklist not just in the acquisition, but all the way through the processing pipelines. There's some checklists, but it kind of morphs because we have to, it's kind of a rite of passage. Everybody has to listen to Stroop audio recordings and mark what word was spoken. And, you know, so there's these kind of tasks that, you know, visiting people, undergrads, all of these people do. And that we want to make sure that it's okay that some of these tasks don't fall through the cracks, that all of these checks are done for every person. So we actually use Basecamp for that, which is a commercial software, but I mean, it's $50. But we find it very worth it where you can assign to-dos to people. So like you mark off, okay, for subject 1, I just finished this step. Now step number 2 needs to be done on this person. So then when another lab member comes to do their 2 hours of work, they can see, okay, what needs to be done? I need to run this on subject 2. And it has really, really helped. So anybody that has kind of a big team, or where you need to make sure that some of these steps don't fall off, you know, and kind of people get lost, that nobody's actually looked at the images. That is kind of a sales pitch, but I would pay this out of pocket if I had to, if we didn't have grant money for it, because it has saved so much stress.
Yeah.
I wasn't here from the beginning, so sorry if I'm asking something you already said, but what's your decision-making process when handling with fMRI data and motion? Do you have some thresholds? Do you use something like frame-wise displacement or
I think there is a lot of different technologies that you can use for motion correction. I think the one that I showed in my talk was also the possibility to do prospective motion correction, which has some advantages over retrospective motion correction, what you were, I think, mentioning, because you basically already during the acquisition of the images correcting for some of the motion problems. So I think this is kind of perhaps like the gold standard technology that I think can be used. And of course, also retrospective motion correction can be done in different ways. So there's also software tools that can actually correct your motion algorithms, but also to detect whether there's an outlier in the image, and perhaps you can then decide on whether you remove those images or you actually rerun those processes to actually optimize the algorithm. So I think there is at the moment, multiple choices that you have on deciding on your motion correction.
I was partially interested in the retrospective analysis, and if I understand it correctly, you have basically two options. You can discard some scans, or you can discard the whole data set. So my question was, when do you decide to discard the whole data set, or when do you decide to discard particular scans? If you use more something like your subjective feeling or exact thresholds?
I mean, there's this general guideline, I think, where you say that your motion shouldn't be more than twice as your voxel size. This is kind of a rough rule of thumb, I think, that applies for some of the 3 Tesla fMRI studies. So, for example, that you kind of look at your voxel resolution and look at how much motion you're able to tolerate. But it also a lot of depends on the related artifacts that come with the motion. So I would strongly recommend for data that show more motion than you would usually tolerate. So, for example, you have, I don't know, a resolution of 1.5 millimeters, and you really see motion more than the voxel size, let's say 1.5 or 2 millimeters, then to really check your data also with respect to the artifacts that are driven by those motion. Because, I mean, the motion itself can often be corrected, but it's often the secondary artifacts that come with the motion that really produce the problem in your data. And then you can try to, there are technologies that you can try to correct those secondary artifacts, but it also a little bit depends on the kind of data you have.
I can jump in this aspect, actually. So I don't think we really conveyed this in different talks. There is a lot of open questions in this space, right? So, for example, how much motion is too much motion? What do you do with individual scans and the whole data set, right? What's acceptable and for which task, etc., right? So there's like a million questions like that, which is the primary basis for me to form the special interest group called NIQC, or the International Center for Neuroimaging Quality Control, International Neuroinformatics Coordinating Facility, INCF. We are meeting tomorrow at 11:30 a.m. You can there's going to be a lot of experts from different modalities. You can ask these questions, and user input is important to build protocols also, right? So follow the group if you want to learn more and contribute to the research.
And We can talk more about what we do and some of the specific studies that I'm in on now, but as Pradeep was saying, there's not a gold standard rule for this. My strong advice is to do some piloting with the sequence you want to do and actually look. I mean, that's how some of you know about the whole respiration, motion, and multiband data that completely shocked me a few years ago when I was first looking at multiband data. But that has actually, the acquisition, if you're using multiband data versus, or some other, with very small voxels, data versus regular data with 3 by 3 by 3 millimeter voxels, how you set the FD thresholds and stuff are going to be completely different. You can't just take one set of thresholds and apply them to every single data set you have. And so in the piloting, I kind of like, okay, what is reasonable? What do I mean, that's subjective, but I was looking at a bunch of our pilot data and marking, okay, I want to censor this, I don't want to censor that. And we kind of fiddled around with an FD threshold that we're using. And so we're using this FD threshold, and then I just fixed it. And we are keeping that FD threshold then until there's, until somebody proves, so it's arbitrary, but at least it's not, it seemed to be the least bad way to do it. But I think it maybe also makes a big difference with task versus resting state, because obviously the implications of motion, I know we have a lot of task in trained motion. In our data set, I was finally able to prove what I was seeing a few weeks ago. What to do about that kind of phenomenon is a whole nother can of worms. Most people don't even look for task entrainment in the motion, but it's all over the place often, but that's a whole nother thing.
Just one final comment on the motion. I think MRI Prep is also a very good program, which actually gives you some estimates also how your motion can be ranked with respect to other associated parameters. So it gives you a whole lot of characteristics on your data, and then you can have a better overview to decide whether this is a serious motion artifact or is still within the range of, let's, for example, the fluctuations are still in the range of the other fluctuations you see in the data. So this is, I think, also a very good program for deciding on those issues.
And I just wanted to pick up on one point that Esther made, about how the artifacts would actually manifest as a result of the motion. So that can really interact with how you've acquired the data. So, multiband versus standard 2D versus 3D EPI, which I was showing earlier. They can be really very different, and you have to see, is the metric that you're going to use to evaluate the data going to pick that up, or is it maybe, not sensitive to that?
And my quick comment here, in diffusion we don't suffer about this because we take all the data. It's too precious.
Too precious. Okay, back, yeah, go ahead.
It's a very general question for all of you, because I'm coming from a children's hospital, and my question is, because I really feel like watching the videos online when I see the data from the baby. So I just want to know if everything like you said, or there's some exception, is applicable to the children, or we need to pay more attention, or there are software or tools that maybe can be more useful. This is kind of all the MRI and PI.
Yeah, so everything I've shown works also on neonatal data. So obviously acquiring neonatal data is a bit more challenging. Think of anesthesia and limited time window to acquire data. So typically you've got less data and maybe a bit more noisy, but in principle all these tools they work on baby data as well. So.
Spatial normalization.
Yeah.
So for the type of stuff I was talking about, of course, it's exactly the same, because it's really about ensuring that the scanner is operating properly, and that has to be the case no matter who it is or what it is that you're going to image. I suppose the issue that I primarily hear about imaging children is just that the level of motion is so much higher, and obviously then if they're smaller, there's issues maybe about sensitivity in terms of being able to have high sensitivity everywhere for them. So I think, again, trying to take approaches that would allow them or enable them to stay stiller during the acquisition are really important, like engaging them in a movie and things like this. restricting the type of motion that's possible by using more padding. These kind of very basic things, but seem to make a big difference.
And just one comment to perhaps give you an overview also over how many of the 7 Tesla centers work. So usually you have really, over the years, acquired a database of subjects who can actually handle this kind of this amount of motion that you can still tolerate. So actually we have a database of people who are able to lie very extremely still in the 7 Tesla scanner. And this took us a long time to actually build up such a database of people who can do it. Just showing you that actually you're actually in the normal population really targeting the kind of the high like top 10% of people who can lie very still. In that respect, it's something you have to have in mind when going like for example to high field with children or patients, that you actually may not be able to apply those analysis procedures for those groups.
Yeah.
I had a general question. Regarding both QA and QC, if you want to put it that way, do you, any of the panel, or anyone else in the room, have experience using version control, both in using GitHub or Open Science Framework for maintaining the version control history of your code? Because if you change your metrics, of course, then all your results are going to change. And then also of comments about experiences storing the data either from a large data set that's acquired over multiple years or from your center over multiple years, and how to best store that, display it, make sure you have your history done.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's really important, and it's actually quite challenging at times. So we use GitHub for version control of all of our sequences and image reconstruction, and trying to link up sequences with image reconstruction and so on is tricky. Then, of course, for processing and all the rest of it, you want to know exactly how you've processed it. So having tools that produce metadata, that track what version was used, all these types of things are, again, really important, And that goes also for analysis stuff like the QA kind of code that we use. Again, that would all be tracked on GitHub so that we know every change we would make. And for example, for QA, you have like a comment field so that you can put in anything that's unusual or write the results to different files. If it's routine stuff versus if it's a test stuff because you've just, for example, changed hardware or you're troubleshooting something or whatever, so that you can keep those data quite separate. So that when you look back at it retrospectively, it's not just all over the place because, something else has been happening, like you were troubleshooting or you're changing things or trying new code or whatever it might be. But it's really quite difficult. So what we use a lot as well to isolate studies from each other is to use Docker and have everything deployed within Docker. Because again, if you containerize, you can kind of isolate the study from anything else that might be developing. Because you want to keep it obviously static during a study, but you don't want others to have to stay behind, or you'd never progress anything really.
I can add a little bit of a project management perspective, so to say, at the consortia level. I think your question touches on like most aspects of QC. Like I think we heard about how important phantom corrections are to maintain scanner performance and quality. So there are many systems that are developed to enable large multi-site studies. I think as many of them are coming out. So systems that I'm familiar with, some in Canada like Loris, BrainCode, etc. They actually have built many processes to handle this over their years of experience on QA, QC, right? You should take a look and see how they do it at the level of acquisition, not at the individual scanning sessions like sequences and version control, right? So there is a lot of work that's going on, still a lot more to be done. So to say, Felix had a question, yeah.
Another comment to the functional fMRI QC. There was a very nice paper by Funi and Thomas Nichols.
Yeah.
Statistics on GWAS that are
Right.
transferable between data sets.
Right.
They write out what I used there. You have first scans significance for bad scans, and they don't align with FD, basically what I saw, which is the classic that works well as well. But that's I would recommend that they have the hybrid version now as well. So
Awesome.
that you get out like 1-0 censoring.
Awesome. Awesome. So we're reaching the end soon. Any quick questions? Any burning questions?
I had one that I was wondering about asking.
Yeah.
It was directed to Alex, actually. And you mentioned about the distortions during your presentation, and I was wondering what you thought about the relative benefits of 3T and 7T and for diffusion imaging, and how one might best QC that choice.
That's a very good one. So I'll be very brief about that. So obviously, if you go to higher fields, some of the distortions are way bigger. So especially the inhomogeneity, like you can sometimes you can't even see the temporal lobes, like they're gone. You know, signal is gone. I think there's a lot of investment nowadays in the hardware, in the coils to improve this, the homogeneity. So from a, let's say, because I work in a medical facility, we don't tend to scan our patients for diffusion on 7 Tesla yet, because we feel the quality, especially the fidelity of these distortions, are not to the level, even after correcting for them, that we want them, basically. But we've known this for a few years now, and now we're taking more hardcore action by also improving a lot on the hardware side, which we can't just deal with tricks in software.
Okay, so I want to end it with a question to my fellow speakers here. So like I mentioned at the beginning, I think we raised a lot of issues in the data and how to detect them, and not many solutions, right? What do you tell the community and the users what to do about it at a really big sense?
Yeah, so I think I put it already on my last slide. I think it's all about collaborations. So I think it's particularly I think it's true for all fields, but I feel it's very strong also for the 7 Tesla community, because it's just that you need so many levels of expertise to actually, as you said, you have to actually work very closely with the physicists who have built in technologies within the scanner environment, often even together with the developer, like with Leemans in our case. So I actually have really collaborators really to the developer of the scanner in first place, to actually, for example, for developing motion correction paradigms. But on the other hand, you're also working very closely together with modeling experts who really kind of try to develop models, generative models on your data in order to correct for some of the artifacts. So I think what I feel this community is extremely interdisciplinary, what I also personally like very much about it. And for this interdisciplinary team to be efficient and, let's say, goal-directed also, it's important to develop a sense of tolerance also towards what other people do not know. So I think the biggest like, let's say, wall in interdisciplinary teams is often like, okay, you don't know this, so you actually don't know very much about your field. But people have to tolerate that different people come with different expertises, and putting them all together kind of makes you acquire a good data set and a good study. And just, to accept that everybody has its own kind of area of expertise. This would actually a little bit of this tolerance towards other people and what they know and where their borders of the knowledge is, would I think make an interdisciplinary team much more fun also to work with, and also much more efficient. So for me, it's also a little bit of a social development there, sometimes necessary, even though in many teams it works excellent, and I have made also very, very good experiences.
Well, I think championing collaboration is the absolute right way to go, and probably a very good point to end on.
All right. Thank you so much. Slides will be posted online. Take a look here. Yeah, follow the NIQC SIG group. Slides and other information will be there, okay?
photographic